Beneath crowns of gold and thrones of power, 30 kings ruled empires by day and guarded forbidden secrets by night. Their histories were written with swords, but their desires whispered between chamber doors, erased, redacted, denied, until now. This isn't the story your textbooks told you. This is the truth behind the velvet curtains, the passion, the politics, the partners history tried to forget. 30 kings, 30 secrets. One question? What does it mean when power dares to love in the dark? Before we dive in, if you love history with sharp edges and darker shadows, hit that subscribe button. This channel unearths the stories they buried, burned, or whispered about in footnotes. And while you're here, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and tell me what time it is right now. Midnight? 3 a.m.? Are you spiraling or just vibing? Let's see who else is awake in the archives with you. Qianlong Emperor. For a man who ruled over a quarter of the Earth's population and penned more poems than Shakespeare and Drake combined, the Qianlong Emperor had a surprisingly scandalous soft spot for a certain young man named He Shen. Now, in theory, He Shen was just another court official, an ambitious, good-looking bureaucrat with a jawline sharp enough to cut imperial red tape. But in practice, he was more like the emperor's favorite human, opium. Qianlong met He Shen when the young man was barely out of puberty and already radiating the kind of charisma that got noblewomen giggling behind fans and made eunuchs nervous. Overnight, He Shen skyrocketed from nobody to second most powerful man in China. And no, it wasn't because he was good at his job. Spoiler, he was objectively terrible at his job. Think HR department run by a pyromaniac raccoon level of bad. So, how does a man so obviously incompetent gain the emperor's obsessive trust, a 20-room mansion, and literal tons of silver? If you ask the Qing court, they whispered one word, Duangxiu, the passion of the cut sleeve. That's ancient Chinese shorthand for, they were definitely more than friends, but we can't print that on the porcelain. While there's no explicit letter from Qianlong saying, P.S. I love you, He Shen, the evidence is damning by omission. Qianlong was meticulous, calculating, and famously emotionally constipated. He was the kind of guy who'd execute his own grandson for being too enthusiastic about fireworks. But He Shen could do no wrong. Corruption? Fine. Embezzlement? Understandable. Mass public outrage? Boys will be boys. He let He Shen accumulate so much wealth, power, and silk robes that the other ministers basically turned into unpaid interns. It wasn't until Qianlong died literally within weeks that the new emperor, Jia arrested He Shen and had him unalived faster than you can say, improper relationship with His Majesty. So what does that tell us? Either Qianlong was blind, incompetent, and dangerously out of touch with reality, or he was in love, deeply, devastatingly, stupidly. And when your heart says yes, but your throne says don't you dare, you do what any closeted 18th century autocrat would do. You immortalize your boyfriend with power, money, and legacy, and then make everyone else pretend it was totally normal. And yes, historians have tried to spin this into Qianlong simply admired He Shen's youthful energy, or they just had a spiritual bond. But if that's all it was, why did no one else in Qianlong's 60-year reign get the same treatment? Not his sons, not his generals, not even the dude who invented the imperial rice cooker. No, only He Shen. The irony? Qianlong styled himself as a paragon of Confucian virtue, loyal, stoic, duty-bound. But behind all that poetic calligraphy and ceremonial dragon robes was a man who may have given absolute power to his heart's desire, even if it meant burning the empire a little on the way down. And here's the punchline. After Hessian's execution, the treasure confiscated from his estate equaled 15 years of national tax revenue. That's not a lover. That's a sugar baby who became the national budget deficit. But if you think that was the most extra gay love story ever wrapped in silk and power struggles, wait until you meet the Roman emperor who took grief to a divine level and turned his boyfriend into a god. Hadrian. It's one thing to love someone, it's another to love them so much you rewrite the stars. Enter Hadrian, Rome's bearded emperor, philosopher, architectural enthusiast, and proud boyfriend of a dead Greek twink named Antinius. Hadrian ruled from 117 to 138 CE, which in Roman terms was basically the soft launch of the empire's midlife crisis. He was known for consolidating borders, touring every inch of the empire like a man with both wanderlust and trust issues, and obsessing over Hellenistic culture like a fanboy who never got over his semester abroad. But behind the toga and the diplomatic tours, Hadrian's legacy was forged in marble, myth, and mourning, all in the name of one very beautiful boy. Antinius was a Greek youth from Bithynia. In modern terms, he would have been cast as the quiet background character in a Netflix period drama until Hadrian slid into his life like a Roman sliding into DMs. What began as a mentor-mentee thing, allegedly, soon became something else closer, deeper, and deeply uncomfortable for the Senate, who had the collective emotional range of a wax statue. Hadrian and Antinius traveled together, slept together, hunted together, and spent years being visibly inseparable, even as the empire churned on in bureaucratic inertia. And then, Nile. In 130 CE, while sailing through Egypt, Antinous died under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, suspicious. Officially, he drowned. Accidentally. Totally just slipped and died in the river like any other 20-year-old demigod in training. But even Romans in togas smelled something fishy. Suicide? Maybe. Ritual sacrifice? Some whispered that Hadrian's obsession had turned religious, and Antinius offered himself to prolong the emperor's life. Or, darker still, maybe Hadrian, unable to face Antinius aging into someone less Instagrammable, allowed or even orchestrated the tragedy. What we do know is this. Hadrian came undone, and not in a private cry in the bathhouse way. He went full "my boyfriend died, so I'm starting a religion" mode. He declared Antinous a god, built temples to him across the empire, established a priesthood, named a city after him, Antinoepolis, and ordered statues, busts, and coins made in his image. Even Alexander the Great's cult of personality was side-eyeing this level of overcompensation. This wasn't just grief. This was a full-blown public branding campaign. And Hadrian, savvy as ever, fused the personal with the political. Deifying Antinous gave his loss cosmic significance. But it also created a unifying imperial symbol, young, beautiful, Greek, tragic, the ultimate state-sanctioned sad boy. Rome tolerated it because Hadrian was still emperor, and deification wasn't that weird if you squinted hard enough. But even they were like, dude, tone it down. Imagine if a U.S. president built shrines across the country to a dead intern, then made it mandatory to light candles in his honor. That's the vibe. Historians have spent centuries trying to reframe the relationship as platonic, pedagogical, or ambiguous because heaven forbid two ancient men had a thing. But Hadrian didn't exactly leave it open to interpretation. His own poetry lamented Antinius's absence like a cursed widower writing Greek fan fiction. And while emperors could deify themselves or their ancestors, no one had ever turned a boyfriend into a state religion. Not Augustus, not Nero, Not even Caligula, and Caligula married his horse. Hadrian, for all his stoic philosophy and architectural obsession, couldn't build a monument big enough to contain his grief. So, he built dozens. And that's the paradox. Hadrian's political legacy was all about stabilizing the empire, but emotionally, he was chaos in a laurel wreath. He mourned with marble. He loved like a god and grieved like a man. So yes, Hadrian ruled Rome. But Antinius ruled Hadrian. From beyond the Nile, beyond death, beyond reason. And if turning your dead lover into a deity seems like the emotional ceiling of ancient gay melodrama, don't worry. The next emperor on our list didn't just cut a sleeve for his favorite boy. He cut through tradition, scandal, and shame like silk. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not here for sanitized history, and I respect that. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. This channel's for the ones who read between the lines, who know the real stories are never the ones carved in stone. Also, where are you watching from? What's the time on your clock right now, 2 a.m.? Noon at your desk pretending to work? Tell me in the comments. Let's map out our little historical insomniac cult. Emperor I of Han. You don't usually associate gay romance with Confucian bureaucracy, jade tablets, and a strict ancestral cult. But then again, you don't usually get an emperor so smitten with his boyfriend that he literally slices off part of his robe to avoid waking him up. That's right. Welcome to the origin story of one of China's most poetic euphemisms for same-sex love, the passion of the cut sleeve. Emperor I of Han wasn't supposed to be this dramatic. He ruled briefly from 7 BCE to 1 BCE, a 6-year blip in the glittering chaos of the Western Han dynasty. But in that short window, he managed to scandalize the court, terrify the ministers, and permanently wedge himself into queer legend. And all because of one man, Dong Xian. Dong Xian was not born into greatness. He wasn't even born into comfort. He was a nobody from a nothing family, which in imperial China meant your destiny was to maybe, if you were lucky, carry water for someone important. But fate, also known as a very love-struck emperor, had other plans. Dong Xian was young, handsome, and probably very good at pretending to be impressed by poetry. Emperor I met him and was, by all accounts, instantly obsessed. We're talking move into the palace levels of fast. Dong Xian didn't just get titles, he got all the titles. Colonel, General, Commander of the Armed Forces. By age 20, he outranked men twice his age and 10 times his experience. All this in a society where hierarchy was more sacred than oxygen. Now, to be fair, favoritism wasn't uncommon in the Han court. Emperors had always played political chess with court factions, wives, and concubines. But A's obsession with Dong Xian wasn't subtle. It wasn't strategic. It was extra. He once declared publicly that Dong Xian was like his shadow, which is poetic unless you're trying to explain to a room full of war-hardened generals why your boyfriend is now leading the military. And then there's the sleeve, the moment that sealed their love story in cultural immortality. According to the Han Shu, an actual historical chronicle, not a soap opera script, one night the emperor and Dong Xian fell asleep on the same bed. I woke up first, found Dong Xian sleeping on his sleeve, and rather than disturb his slumber, he took a knife and sliced the sleeve off. That's it. That's the moment. That's how gay love entered the Chinese idiomatic canon. Historians, ever uncomfortable with romance that doesn't lead to royal heirs, tried to dismiss it as symbolic. Maybe it was just a story to shame I for being a weak ruler. Or maybe it was a metaphor for favoritism. But no one's writing sleeve-cutting stories about favorite generals or economic advisors. This was something else, something tender, intimate. undeniably romantic. The scandal was less about the relationship and more about what it represented. An emperor prioritizing personal affection over governance. Ministers grumbled, families raged, and when Emperor Ai died suddenly at 26, the court pounced. Dong Xian, once supreme commander of the army, was stripped of all rank and given a helpful suggestion: kill yourself, which he did alongside his wife, in a display of loyalty that left historians confused, impressed, and deeply unsettled. What remains is a legacy that's half tragedy, half folklore, a gay love story in ancient China, preserved not just in dusty records but in language itself. To this day, cut sleeve is still used in Chinese to describe male love. Emperor Ai didn't win any wars, he didn't reform the state. His reign was short, chaotic, and, according to traditional accounts, weak. But in loving Dongxian so openly, so irrationally, and so poetically, he did something remarkable. He carved queer tenderness into the bones of imperial history. And speaking of doomed affection and terrible political instincts, let's hop a few thousand miles west to medieval England, where a certain king gave his heart and half the country to a swaggering knight named Piers, Edward II of England. Edward II, medieval England's most unfortunate romantic. A man who thought with his heart, ruled with his libido, and paid for it with something considerably more gruesome than a breakup playlist. If Qianlong had Hessian, and Hadrian had Antinius, Edward had Piers Gaveston, a swaggering knight with excellent cheekbones, terrible political instincts, and the charisma of a man who knew he could get away with murder. At least, until he couldn't. Edward ascended the English throne in 1307, inheriting not only a war with Scotland but also the thoroughly impossible expectations of being the son of Edward, aka Hammer of the Scots, aka the king who inspired Braveheart's angriest scenes. So, imagine everyone's surprise when Edward decided to celebrate his coronation, not by crushing enemies or making alliances, but by throwing a lavish feast where Piers Gaveston, his longtime companion and presumed lover, was the real guest of honor. Nobles were scandalized. Queens were snubbed. And Edward? He was too busy staring dreamily at Piers to notice or care. Let's not be coy. The bond between Edward and Gaveston wasn't your typical bromance. This was a full-blown emotional entanglement in a time when courtly love was meant for maidens in towers, not swaggering Frenchmen with fancy clothes and a penchant for taunting the aristocracy. Piers didn't just enjoy Edward's company. He basked in his favor. Edward showered him with lands, titles, jewels, and most damningly unfettered influence. It wasn't long before Gaveston was walking around like he was the king, and Edward? He was walking behind him like a lovesick squire. The barons, predictably, were livid. This wasn't just about jealousy or homophobia, although let's be honest, medieval England wasn't exactly waving rainbow flags. It was about power. Gaveston was a nobody, a foreigner and an upstart. His elevation threatened the delicate, already fractured hierarchy of the English nobility. But instead of playing politics, Edward doubled down. Every time they exiled Gaveston, Edward begged him to return. Every time they warned him, he rewarded Piers even more. It was a classic, toxic couple, dynamic, complete with breakups, reunions, and ultimately, betrayal. In 1312, the barons had enough. They captured Gaveston, dragged him to Warwick Castle, and executed him without trial. It was not subtle. They didn't even pretend it was legal. Edward was devastated. Historians say he wept openly, refused food, threatened vengeance, wrote sad poetry, the works. But more than that, he never forgave the men who killed his beloved, and it clouded his judgment for the rest of his reign. And that's where things get grim. Edward, never the sharpest sword in the scabbard, lost not just his lover but his grip on the throne. His marriage to Isabella of France, who had all the patience of a cobra in heat, deteriorated. His military campaigns floundered. His alliances crumbled. Eventually, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, led a full-blown coup. Edward was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. And his death? Let's just say it comes with one of the most disturbing rumors in royal history, that he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted where the sun does not shine. Was it true? Probably not. But the fact that people believed it says a lot about how his reign and his sexuality were remembered. It was scandal turned into spectacle, misgovernance turned into grotesque poetry. Edward II wasn't a good king. Even his supporters admit that. But what makes him fascinating isn't his incompetence, it's his vulnerability. In a world of brutal kings and arranged marriages, he dared to love openly, foolishly, tragically. His downfall wasn't just about bad politics. It was about emotional excess in a system built on repression. And if you think Edward's story is wild, buckle up. The next ruler on our list turned his slave into a soulmate and inspired an entire genre of Persian poetry in the process. Mahmud of Ghazni. If you're picturing a medieval Islamic sultan as a grim-faced, humorless man surrounded by gold camels and decapitated heads, you're mostly correct. But Mahmud of Ghazni, conqueror of India, destroyer of temples, and self-proclaimed sword of Islam, had a deeply poetic Achilles heel. A slave boy named Malik Ayaz, whose beauty was said to have made even the minarets blush. Mahmud ruled from 998 to 1030 CE, and on paper looked like your textbook alpha warrior medieval ruler. He expanded his empire from Persia to northern India, looted enough gold to cause early inflation, and was so dedicated to religious orthodoxy that he burned entire cities just to make a theological point. But under the iron helmet was a man who, according to poets and chroniclers alike, fell absolutely, devastatingly in love. Malik Ayaz was a Turkic slave, young, dazzlingly handsome, intelligent, and originally acquired like you would a horse or a very expensive carpet. But this wasn't just your average master-servant dynamic. Mahmud didn't just grant Ayaz his freedom, he elevated him to commander of the army, governor of Lahore, and the only person in his court allowed to call him out for acting like a lunatic. Historians in the 11th century tried to write it off as exceptional loyalty or the deep bond of chivalric respect. But Persian poets were far less subtle. Mahmud's contemporaries wrote of Malik's beauty in terms normally reserved for divine revelations. Eyes like almonds, skin like moonlight, lips that launched empires. And Mahmud? He was smitten. Not quietly, not strategically, but in the way a man gets smitten when power stops being enough. There are entire verses that describe Mahmud lying awake at night, yearning, weeping, praying to God for Ayaz's love. This from the same man who once ordered the massacre of an entire city for resisting conversion. Their relationship became such a recurring theme in Persian literature that it evolved into a trope, Mahmud and Ayaz, as shorthand for the impossible balance between love and hierarchy, passion and piety. Some versions insist Mahmud kept his feelings pure, an unconsummated love, noble in its restraint. Others claim they were intimate, deeply, and scandalously so. The truth, of course, is locked in the past. But the obsession, the power imbalance, The metaphorical poetry about kissing and bondage? That's all very well documented. So what was it, really? Was Mahmud simply captivated by Ayaz's virtue and beauty in a way that transcended the carnal? Or was this one of history's earliest examples of a closeted ruler masking an open secret with military appointments and literary euphemisms? Either way, it worked. Ayaz remained loyal to Mahmud until the very end. When the Sultan died, Ayaz reportedly wept over his body, built a shrine in his honor, and lived the rest of his life as a quiet echo of the empire they'd once ruled together. And the poets kept writing. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the romance or the power dynamic, it's the irony. Mahmud, champion of Islamic orthodoxy, destroyer of idol-worshipping cities, supposedly wrote love poems about a man he could never openly love. He stood for submission to divine law while secretly submitting himself to a single mortal. In trying to conquer the world, he may have been conquered by something far softer, far more dangerous, desire. And perhaps that's why Mahmud of Ghazni still lingers in historical memory, not just as a sultan, but as a symbol of contradiction. A man who could destroy cities with his armies, but couldn't destroy the ache in his chest for a boy who started as a slave and ended as something far more dangerous, an equal. But Mahmud wasn't the only emperor to fall for a male companion in the Han dynasty's golden robes and long silences. Let's return to China now, to another emperor, another man, and yet another dangerous kind of affection. Emperor Wen of Han. If ever there was a monarch whose public image screamed, humble Confucian bureaucrat, it was Emperor Wen of Han, stoic, frugal, dispassionate, the kind of guy who wore plain robes to court, limited palace spending, and allegedly punished himself for minor faults. He was so committed to virtue, he refused to eat anything that tasted good if it wasn't prescribed by a physician. He was the emperor you could bring home to your strict, moralizing grandmother. And yet buried beneath all that ritual restraint and moral austerity was a peculiar affection, a quiet but unmistakable closeness with one man, Deng Tong. Deng Tong was not born into power. He didn't come from an illustrious lineage or rise through military conquest. He wasn't a strategic advisor or a distant cousin shoved into the bureaucracy by necessity. He was just there, handsome, loyal, and, according to some records, mysteriously indispensable to the emperor. It started innocently enough. Wen noticed Deng while reviewing the palace guards. That's a normal day for a ruler. But what followed was not. The emperor became so enamored with Deng Tong that he gave him enormous privileges, including, most famously, a license to mint his own money. Now, let's pause. That's not a metaphor. Emperor Wen, who had previously outlawed private minting to stabilize the economy, handed Deng his own personal mint, as in, you can now legally produce your own currency because I like your face. You know, it's real love when someone rewrites fiscal policy just for you. The official excuse was that Deng had saved the emperor's life. He'd been present when Wen fell ill, helped him recover, etc. But other sources paint a more intimate picture. They describe Deng not merely as a courtier or a friend, but as someone who slept close to the emperor's heart. Ancient Chinese historians were usually careful with their phrasing, so when they start using romantic language to describe your sleeping arrangements, you know something was up. Literally, probably. But here's where the contradiction kicks in. Wen was the very embodiment of Confucian virtue: thrift, order, hierarchy, moderation. And Confucianism, for all its philosophical nuance, was big on heteronormative family values. The emperor's job wasn't just to govern it, was to set a moral example for all under heaven. which meant producing heirs with empresses, not sharing blankets with charmingly cheek-boned mint owners. So how did Wen manage both? How did he reconcile his austere public virtue with his extravagant personal favoritism? He didn't. He just pretended there wasn't a contradiction at all. Deng Tong continued to enjoy imperial favor, amass wealth, and circulate his own currency, while Emperor Wen continued to preach about moderation and self-restraint. The court gossiped, ministers grumbled, but the emperor, calm, quiet, unreadable, acted like there was nothing to see. And then, just like that, the emperor died. And Deng Tong, he lost everything. The mint, the money, the titles. He was stripped of his privileges by the next administration and faded into poverty. According to some accounts, he died alone and penniless, a living metaphor for how love, even royal love, can be, as fleeting as a dynasty's promises. What lingers, though, is the irony. Wen of Han is remembered as a moral paragon, a ruler who governed with Confucian virtue and suppressed excess. But in the shadow of that legacy stands a quiet story of devotion. A ruler who gave his favorite not just affection, but economic sovereignty. A man so disciplined in statecraft and so undisciplined in love. And if you think that contrast is rich, wait until you meet the king who wrote love letters to his male courtiers, called them his sweet child, and ruled England while giggling behind a lace collar. James I of England, James VI of Scotland. If there's one thing, James, I loved more than quoting the Bible in 3 languages and arguing about witches, it was falling head over heels for tall, handsome men with courtier credentials and tight breeches. This was a king who tried very hard to be a godly monarch, and yet couldn't resist writing increasingly embarrassing love notes to his favorites while Parliament side-eyed the royal bedroom like it was a political liability wrapped in perfume-scented parchment. James inherited not just the throne of England in 1603, but also a kingdom torn apart by religious division, Elizabethan hangovers, and a barely repressed fear that the Scots were coming to steal all the good wine. But James, born James VI of Scotland, came south with a different kind of energy. He was educated, fussy, deeply devout, and absolutely incapable of pretending his male favorites were just good friends. He also may have been the only monarch in British history whose personal love life sparked more poetry than his political career. Let's start with Robert Carr. James met him in 1607, when Carr fell off a horse in front of the king and landed, poetically, into favor. James took one look and said, effectively, "Mine." Carr was young, comely, and not especially bright, but he didn't need to be. The king taught him Latin, fed him gossip, gave him titles, and spent hours mooning over him like a lovesick schoolboy. Letters from James to Carr survive, and they are not subtle. "I desire only to live within your bosom," he once wrote, which would have been romantic if he hadn't been 40 and the King of England. But Carr, being human, eventually did what all 17th century soap opera characters do. He got entangled in a scandal involving poison, and his wife, and murder, the usual. James, mortified, distanced himself from Carr and slid directly into the arms of his next male favorite, George Villiers. Now this was the real deal. Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, was everything Carr wasn't: charming, politically savvy, and photogenic in a way that made the royal painter blush. Their relationship was so blatantly intimate that foreign ambassadors complained. Parliament murmured. And James responded by doubling down, elevating Villiers to ridiculous levels of power, and writing letters that made even the Vatican raise an eyebrow. "I naturally so love your person and adore all your other parts." James once wrote to George, "Which are more than ever one man had. That's not statesmanship, that's infatuation. And not even the carefully worded kind. This was royal thirst poured directly onto vellum. Was it a romantic friendship, a political alliance, or an actual sexual relationship? Historians debate it like it's a Supreme Court case. Some insist it was emotional but chaste, a product of a different era's language. Others point out that the degree of favoritism, the physical closeness, the private letters, and the sheer public drama of it all makes that interpretation about as convincing as calling the notebook a story about friendship. What's undeniable is this: James's emotional world was tangled up with his male favorites. His letters, his court appointments, his sudden rages and indulgences, they all orbited the gravity of whoever he was obsessed with at the time. He gave Villiers control over royal patronage, foreign policy input, and even access to his private chambers at all hours. It wasn't just love, it was codependency in an ermine robe. And while James was busy gushing over George and annoying Parliament, his actual queen, Anne of Denmark, was quietly watching from the sidelines, presumably knitting and imagining what life would have been like if she'd married a Danish goat instead. But here's the twist. James, for all his scandalous affection and thinly veiled love poetry, is remembered as a king who united crowns and translated the Bible. The King James Bible, no less the greatest PR move ever made by a possibly gay monarch. So yes, James I loved men. Probably, deeply, often unwisely, but the real irony? His affection helped shape the politics of England and the English language itself. And if you think mixing love, power, and scandal is dangerous in a court with powdered wigs, wait until you step into medieval India, where a ruthless sultan fell for his own eunuch general, Alauddin Khalji. In the medieval Delhi Sultanate, power wasn't just a game, it was a blood sport. Assassinations weren't scandals, they were strategic plans. Court etiquette often involved poison, and loyalty had the shelf life of fresh naan in the sun. Into this pit of intrigue and backstabbing rode Alauddin Khalji, a man so ruthless he made Machiavelli look like a gentle team-building coach. Yet, amidst the tax reforms, military campaigns, and spectacular executions, Alauddin had a strangely tender blind spot: his eunuch general and closest companion, Malik Kafur. Now, eunuch general isn't a phrase that gets thrown around often, but Kafur was no ordinary court pet. Originally, a slave purchased during a raid in Gujarat, allegedly for 1,000 dinars, hence his nickname Hazar Dinari, he was brought to Alauddin's court as war spoils, a beautiful and broken boy from the south. Except he didn't stay broken. He rose quickly, alarmingly, suspiciously fast, even by medieval standards where favoritism was basically a government policy. Kafur wasn't just allowed into Alauddin's inner circle, he became the circle. He was soon in charge of the army, imperial policy, palace security, and depending on which chronicle you read, the Sultan's heart. There's no love poetry between them, this wasn't the Persian court, and Alauddin didn't strike anyone as the flowers and metaphors type. But actions, as always, speak louder than state-sanctioned chronicles. Under Kafur's command, the Delhi army stormed into South India like a force of nature. He led successful campaigns against the Hoysalas, the Kakatiyas, and even the Pandya kingdom, bringing back enough loot to finance Alauddin's economic experiments and paranoia-fueled fortresses. His military genius was undeniable, his influence was terrifying, and yet no one could figure out exactly why the Sultan trusted him so completely. Alauddin was known for eliminating anyone who got too close. Brothers, uncles, Advisors, if they breathed too loudly near his throne, they were either exiled, blinded, or quietly shuffled off the mortal coil. But not Kafur. Kafur not only survived, he thrived. While noblemen seethed and generals plotted, he remained the untouchable shadow beside the throne. There are even records of Alauddin handing over official administrative control to Kafur during his final years, when the Sultan grew increasingly ill and paranoid. That's not just delegation. That's emotional dependency. And then there's the deathbed moment. When Alauddin died in 1316, possibly from illness, possibly from his own anxieties finally chewing through his gut, Kafur seized power instantly. He hid the death from the court, locked the palace gates, and installed Alauddin's minor son on the throne with himself as regent. Not just regent, regent emperor. The military bowed to him. The court fell silent. This eunuch, this ex-slave, this companion had become, for all intents and purposes, ruler of the most powerful Islamic empire in India. It lasted all of 35 days. Kafur's rise was as shocking as his fall. The other nobles finally acted. He was captured, tortured, and executed, allegedly hacked to death in a back room by rivals who'd had enough of his pretty face and unchecked authority. But the fact that he'd gotten that far? Unthinkable. Unrepeatable. Unmistakably tied to the unique, tangled, and deeply suspicious relationship he had with Alauddin Khalji. Did Alauddin love Kafur? The records won't say it outright, but love, in that court, wouldn't have been roses and moonlight anyway. It would have looked exactly like this, power bestowed recklessly, rivals ignored, and loyalty rewarded not with affection, but control. If this wasn't love, it was something very close. Obsession, possession, maybe even devotion expressed through political anointment instead of pillow talk. And here's the twisted epilogue. For centuries, historians tried to erase Kafur from the narrative or explain him away as an anomaly. But the rumor never died. The idea that Alauddin, the conqueror, the despot, was captivated by a beautiful, castrated slave made him human in a way no battle ever could. But if you think that's the most poetic a ruler could get about his male general, you haven't heard about the emperor who loved his soldier so much. He carved him into legend and maybe into eternity. Emperor Wen of Chen. If love stories in Chinese dynasties were written in brushstrokes, then Emperor Wen of Chen's tale with Han Zigao would be drawn in the softest ink and the sharpest irony. This was not the imperial pageantry of Confucian platitudes or state-scripted romance. This was a southern dynasty emperor handing his heart and arguably the fate of his throne to a soldier so beautiful that his name became poetry, and so loyal that he followed his emperor into death, more or less. Let's rewind a bit. The Chen dynasty, which reigned during China's southern dynasties period, was already teetering on unstable ground. It was the last of 4 ephemeral dynasties between the fall of the Jin and the rise of the Sui, so things were chaotic, borders were sketchy, and emperors rose and fell like regional managers at a cursed startup. Into this turmoil stepped Chen, later known as Emperor Wen of Chen, a man trying to stabilize a nation and, along the way, found himself completely and inconveniently enchanted by a young man named Han Zigao. Han wasn't born into aristocracy. He wasn't even born into relevance. His story reads more like an imperial Cinderella, except swap the slipper for armor and the fairy godmother for a very observant crown prince. Han began as a servant in the Chen household, noted not for his station but for his looks. And this wasn't just courtly attractive. No, Han Zigao was described as so beautiful that even hardened generals and jaded courtiers couldn't help but notice and likely grit their teeth about it. When Prince Chen saw him, he didn't just offer him a job, he offered him his future. He elevated Han to the role of personal attendant, then military officer, then general. Fast. Too fast, by palace standards. It wasn't long before Han was standing beside the prince at ceremonies, leading troops into battle, and, according to the court gossip mills, sleeping not very far from the royal bed. Some sources delicately frame their relationship as a deep friendship. Others, particularly poetry and folk tales, drop the euphemisms and go straight for the romance. When Chen Qian ascended the throne in 559 CE, he made Han a trusted member of his inner circle, unprecedented for someone of his humble origins. Han's titles multiplied. His command of the imperial guard became absolute. And their relationship, already whispered about in halls and behind fans, was immortalized in painted portraits and epistolary tributes. One famous piece of art, a wall painting from Han Zigao's tomb, depicts a tall figure believed to be the emperor standing beside a slightly smaller, refined man in military regalia, Han. The composition is intimate, the gaze almost tender. If this were a romance drama, it would be the scene before the inevitable heartbreak. Because heartbreak was coming. Emperor Wen died suddenly in 566 CE, and the court, already irritated by Han's influence, closed in. Han Zigao, trying to preserve the emperor's legacy and protect the next heir, attempted to suppress factions at court. But power is a fickle inheritance, and enemies are always patient. Han was accused of plotting against the throne. Whether this was true or political theater hardly matters. He was arrested and, like so many imperial favorites, given the gentle option of suicide to preserve a sliver of honor. He took it. It was a quiet, devastating end to a story that had lived so loudly in the whispers of courtiers and the strokes of court painters. And here's the poetic punch to the ribs. Han Zigao's tomb still exists. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered it complete with murals and inscriptions and found, to no one's great surprise, that his grave was carefully crafted, unusually elaborate for a non-emperor. It was as if someone wanted him remembered not as a general, not as a servant, but as something else entirely. Perhaps as a beloved. So yes, Emperor Wen of Chen was many things. Ruler, stabilizer, patron of order. But through Han Zigao, he became something rarer. A man who let the walls of court etiquette slip just long enough to leave behind a scandal, a tomb, and a love story painted in silence. But don't get too misty-eyed. Our next emperor didn't just love men, he married them, wore their clothes, and made the Roman Senate wonder if they'd accidentally elected a drag queen with a death wish. Elagabalus. If the Roman Empire was a soap opera, Elagabalus was the chaotic season finale. Crowned emperor at just 14 and assassinated before he hit 18, his reign was a whirlwind of incense, silk, sex, and sacrilege. While his political decisions left senators clutching their togas in despair, it was his very public love life, complete with cross-dressing, male marriages, and enough glittering scandal to fuel 1,000 gossip scrolls that made him a legend, or, depending on your perspective, a cautionary tale. Let's set the scene. Elagabalus was born in Syria, in the city of Emesa, where his family served as hereditary high priests of the sun god Elagabalus. That's not a nickname, that's literally where he got his emperor name. When political fortune flipped like a poorly balanced amphora, the teenage priest suddenly became Rome's emperor, installed by a scheming grandmother and an ambitious mother who made the Kardashians look like medieval monks. From the moment he entered Rome, Elagabalus made it very clear he wasn't interested in being anyone's idea of a traditional Roman ruler. First, he brought his foreign deity with him and tried to install it as the empire's chief god. Picture walking into the Vatican with a statue of a pineapple and demanding it replace Jesus, then multiply the outrage by 100. But more than theology, What truly sent Roman eyebrows into orbit was Elagabalus's aggressive, flamboyant, unapologetically queer personal life. This was not a man who loved men discreetly. He married at least 5 times during his short reign, but 2 of those marriages were to the horror of the Senate to men. Not lovers, not companions, husbands. The most infamous of these was Hierocles, a blond, muscular charioteer from Caria, who Elagabalus reportedly referred to as "my husband" and delighted in publicly kissing. And then there was Aurelius Zodicus, a Greek athlete famed for his physique and reportedly brought to the palace specifically for his talents. Let's say the imperial gaze lingered. Ancient sources, some of whom may have been more offended than honest, claim Elagabalus enjoyed playing the role of wife, that he wore women's makeup, dresses, wigs, that he begged his partners to call him lady or empress, that he offered vast sums to any physician who could surgically fashion him a vagina, an ancient, tragic nod toward gender dysphoria in an empire that didn't have the vocabulary for it, let alone the compassion. Was he transgender by modern terms? Was it performance, politics, or personal identity? The answer, like all imperial scandal, is probably somewhere between misunderstood and deliberately misrepresented. What's undeniable is this: Elagabalus lived his truth louder than any ruler in Roman history and was punished for it with both vilification and death. The Roman Senate hated him. The Praetorian Guard despised him. Even his family, once benefactors of his reign, decided that maybe the empire would be better off without their glitter-drenched teenage emperor inviting strangers into the palace for group rituals that blurred the line between religious ecstasy and an orgy with candles. Eventually, they acted. In 222 CE, Elagabalus and his mother were murdered by the guard. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mutilated, and dumped in the Tiber River like last week's spoiled fish. And yet, he endured. Not in bronze or statues, those were all smashed, but in stories. In the slanderous, breathless, fascinated accounts of historians who couldn't stop writing about him. Elagabalus became the empire's queer ghost, haunting the margins of respectability with silk, scandal, and subversion. A chaotic monarch, yes, possibly mentally ill, probably reckless, but also undeniably someone who lived more authentically, more defiantly, and more outrageously than any emperor before or since. And while Elagabalus may have shocked Rome with his weddings and wigs, back in Han China, another emperor was quietly climbing into bed with his favorite male concubine where things got so romantic, he forgot his sleeve and invented a metaphor that still lives on today. Emperor Wu of Han. Emperor Wu of Han was, by all accounts, a man of ambition. He didn't just expand the Han dynasty, he launched it into the stratosphere. Under his rule, China gobbled up territory, crushed enemies, standardized rituals, and generally operated like a very elegant war machine. He was brilliant, ruthless, reform-minded, and if the court records are to be believed, occasionally distracted by beautiful young men with excellent posture. Now, compared to his great-grandson Emperor Ai, he of the cut-sleeve fame Emperor Wu kept things a little more implied. There are no romantic sonnets, no nightgowns tragically abandoned in the moonlight. But if you look closely at the imperial archives, certain names start to shimmer with a suspicious glow. One such name, Hanyan. Hanyan wasn't a famous general or a towering bureaucrat. He wasn't building roads or fighting Huns or giving rousing speeches about Confucian virtues. What he was, however, was a palace attendant of remarkable beauty, described in court documents with the kind of floral detail usually reserved for immortal cranes or extremely desirable jade ornaments. This wasn't unusual for the time. The Han court was no stranger to male favorites. In fact, same-sex intimacy had a long-standing presence in early imperial China, often sliding in under the radar of Confucian rigidity thanks to the elite's fondness for poetry, calligraphy, and occasionally treating gender norms like soft guidelines. What made Emperor Wu's case interesting is how thoroughly he broke his own patterns for Hanyan. The emperor was known for being calculating, emotionally reserved, hyper-strategic, and deeply aware of image. He could exile a concubine for a bad omen, execute a minister for a misstep, and switch alliances faster than a falcon changes altitude. But for Hanyan, he played favorites. He ignored complaints. He promoted him far beyond his merit. He allowed him into closed-door court deliberations, an unheard-of privilege for someone who'd once held a towel for the emperor's bath. And yet, history tries very hard not to say why. Some historians describe the relationship as brotherly, which in Chinese imperial speak is the literary equivalent of "we're just roommates." Others claim that Hanyan was helpful to the emperor during moments of personal grief and illness, a subtle euphemism if ever there was one. And then there are the mentions of affection and closeness that appear in the official Han records, always carefully stripped of overt implication, but always lingering. The imperial court, of course, noticed. Ministers complained of undue influence. Gossip swirled around the marble columns, but Wu didn't care. Not because he was reckless, but because he was the emperor. And emperors didn't have to explain themselves. What makes Wu's dynamic with Hanyan so compelling isn't that it was secretive or explosive, it's that it was quiet, subtle, a whisper woven into an empire of shouts. In a reign marked by military conquest and ritual rigidity, the emperor allowed himself one sliver of softness. One presence he didn't question, one relationship where he broke his own rules. And when Hanyan died still relatively young, still scandalously beloved, Emperor Wu reportedly grieved in a way his court had never seen. No public rituals, no national mourning, but a silence descended. A pause. As if the great machinery of conquest had lost a tiny, irreplaceable cog. It's easy to forget that behind the jade screens and bronze mirrors of ancient courts, emperors were still people ambitious, flawed, and sometimes desperately attached to the ones who made them feel less alone. For Emperor Wu, that was Hanyan. And if you thought subtle glances and whispered rumors were enough to rock a throne, just wait for the shogun who made no effort to hide his love for young samurai and turned same-sex courtship into a warrior's code. Tokugawa Iemitsu. Some rulers inherit kingdoms, others inherit legacies. Tokugawa Iemitsu inherited a social order so tightly wound, so rigidly Confucian, that even smiling in public could be considered a minor breach of decorum. As the third shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty, ruling in the early 1600s, Iemitsu presided over an era of Sakoku Japan's grand lockdown when foreigners were banned, Christianity was outlawed, and everyone was busy pretending nothing interesting was happening behind the paper screens. Spoiler: something interesting was definitely happening. Because while Iemitsu was busy enforcing national isolation and inventing mandatory social repression, he also had a particular weakness for a very domestic, very culturally accepted form of emotional release. Beautiful young men in armor. And not just any young men, his pages, his attendants, and in some stories, entire squads of fresh-faced samurai who caught the shogun's eye and were promptly swept into a system known as Shudo. Let's be clear, Shudo or nanshoku, literally male colors, wasn't some fringe subculture. It was an entire institution, woven deep into the samurai code like cherry blossoms and death poems. It framed relationships between older samurai and younger male apprentices as noble, spiritual, and erotically charged with virtue. Think mentorship, but with more poetry and occasional swordplay of the non-combat kind. Enter Iemitsu, born into this system, steeped in it from adolescence, and possessing what the records call a deep devotion to the beautiful youths of his court. He didn't just participate, he embodied the aesthetic. He kept a circle of young attendants around him, many of them strikingly attractive and trained in both etiquette and martial arts. One in particular, whose name is scrubbed from some records and mythologized in others, was said to be the shogun's constant companion. He accompanied Iemitsu on hunting trips, slept in his quarters, and once, in an especially theatrical flourish, performed a tea ceremony shirtless while reciting Buddhist scripture. Yes, that was considered a love language in Edo, Japan. The relationship wasn't exactly private, but it wasn't scandalous either. In a world where women were cloistered, court marriage was political theater, and emotional intimacy was rare outside of ritual. Shudo provided an outlet that was not only accepted, but sometimes idealized. It didn't threaten inheritance, because samurai were still expected to marry and produce heirs. It didn't upend the system, because it was part of the system. And Iemitsu, despite being a control freak with paranoia issues, embraced it fully. He wrote letters dripping with longing, commissioned poems for his lovers. Once, when one of his favorites died unexpectedly, Iemitsu reportedly secluded himself for days, emerging gaunt and quiet, refusing all court business. That wasn't just grief, that was heartbreak behind a lacquered mask. But of course, nothing gold can stay, not in court, not in politics, and especially not in the paranoid shadow world of the Tokugawa Bakufu. As Iemitsu aged, his passions turned inward. He doubled down on repression, banned Christianity more harshly, tortured suspected converts, and implemented the brutal Sanken-Kotai system, forcing daimyo to leave their families behind and travel constantly between their domains and Edo. Essentially, government-enforced long-distance parenting. It's tempting to psychoanalyze. A ruler who couldn't live fully openly, weaponizing repression outward. But maybe it's simpler than that. Iemitsu lived in a system where male-male affection was allowed so long as it remained within a strictly defined aesthetic. When it got messy, or emotional, or power-threatening, that's when problems started. And yet, the legacy lingered. His court diaries mention names, beautiful boys turned companions turned memories. The poems survive. The letters, the whispers, in the paper-thin walls of Edo Castle. So no, Tokugawa Iemitsu didn't break the system. He was the system, its contradictions, its beauty, its brutal elegance. And his love stories? They were hidden in plain sight, sandwiched between military reforms and tea ceremonies, waiting for someone to read between the brushstrokes. Now buckle up. Because if Japan's shogunate flirted with quiet elegance, the next emperor on our list threw all subtlety out the palace window. Think gold leaf, theatrics, and a dead twink turned royal bride. Yes, it's time for Nero. Nero? History has not been kind to Nero. He's remembered as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, murdered his own mother, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and thought he could sing his way to political stability. He didn't. But what often gets overlooked between the fire, poisonings, incest, and poetry is Nero's particular romantic proclivities. Namely, marrying men, dressing as a bride, and staging wedding ceremonies that made the Roman elite cry into their goblets. Nero's sexuality wasn't just a footnote, it was a theatrical centerpiece in a life already bursting at the seams with deranged spectacle. He wasn't merely a bisexual tyrant dabbling in scandal, he was a one-man pride parade in imperial purple, and in classic Nero fashion, when he fell for someone, he didn't whisper sweet nothings in the atrium. He threw a wedding, invited the whole court, and demanded everyone take it seriously, or else. The most infamous of these relationships involved two freedmen, Pythagoras and Sporus. Let's start with Pythagoras. Nero took him as a husband, not metaphorically, not behind closed doors, but in a public ceremony where Nero played the bride. Yes, the bride. He wore a veil, walked down the aisle, and exchanged vows like he was auditioning for the title role in RuPaul's Imperial Drag Race. This wasn't mere roleplay. Nero referred to Pythagoras as his spouse, enacted rituals in full Roman matrimonial tradition, and even called himself wife in front of senators too terrified to do anything but applaud and sip their wine awkwardly. But the story that truly earns Nero his place in this hall of morally confusing, emotionally chaotic royal love stories is his marriage to Sporus. Sporus was a young boy, described as exceptionally beautiful, dangerous words in Nero's orbit. After the violent death of Poppaea Sabina, Nero's pregnant wife, whom he likely killed in a fit of rage by kicking her in the stomach, he began to spiral. Then he saw Sporus. And here's where it gets uncomfortably Freudian. Sporus bore a striking resemblance to the late Poppaea. Instead of processing his guilt like a normal human therapy, maybe, a vacation, Nero did what any emotionally shattered autocrat with unlimited power and no sense of boundaries would do. He had the boy castrated and forced him into the role of empress. Nero dressed Sporus in Poppaea's clothes, called him by her name, paraded him through the imperial palace on his arm. Together, they traveled the empire like a macabre honeymoon tour, with Sporus sitting beside Nero on the imperial throne during public appearances. There was no illusion of discretion. Nero wanted everyone to see. This was not just delusion. It was theater. It was punishment. It was penance. It was grief in a toga, weaponized and warped beyond recognition. Some sources paint Sporus as a passive victim, an orphan beauty too young and powerless to resist. Others hint that he learned to survive Nero's world with subtlety, playing the part, performing the illusion of affection to maintain his precarious hold on privilege and life. Either way, his story doesn't end well. After Nero's death, Sporus was passed between powerful Roman men like a cursed artifact. One of them, Nymphidius Sabinus, also planned to marry him because apparently Rome didn't have enough trauma. But let's return to Nero himself. Because for all his atrocities, theatrical excess, and flamboyant cruelty, his relationships with Pythagoras and Sporus reveal something uncomfortably human, a desperate longing for connection, however twisted. Nero's love wasn't gentle or kind, it was possessive, performative, pathological. But it was love in the way only a man raised by vipers and handed supreme power at 16 could love. And if Nero forced love into masks and rituals, our next emperor kept his companions close not with threats or ceremonies, but with an entire shadow court of beautiful boys carefully selected, elaborately dressed, and intimately involved. Let's take a detour east, to Goryeo, Korea, where Emperor Gongmin turned grief and repression into a dangerous kind of devotion. Emperor Gongmin of Goryeo. There are monarchs who rule through strategy. There are monarchs who rule through fear. And then there was Emperor Gongmin of Goryeo, a ruler who ruled through grief, painting, and a growing circle of exquisitely dressed young men who may or may not have doubled as his unofficial harem. To understand Gongmin is to understand contradiction. Born in 1330, he was sent to Yuan China as a political hostage, a classic Goryeo coming-of-age story, minus the emotional stability. He spent his formative years under the watchful eyes of a Mongol court, more interested in submission than sentiment. When he returned to Korea and ascended the throne in 1351, it was with a traumatic education in obedience, a rage simmering just under the surface, and eventually a thirst for control, dressed in silk and eyeliner. At first, Gongmin tried to be a reformer. He purged corrupt officials. He seized land from aristocrats. He reduced Mongol influence and built a stronger Korean identity. But politics is a brutal, unloving business. Every reform earned him more enemies. Every noble stripped of power whispered against him. And then came the death that unraveled everything. Queen Noguk, his Mongol-born wife, and by all accounts his one genuine emotional anchor. Her death in 1365 was a rupture. Gongmin did not just mourn, he collapsed. He stopped attending court, stopped issuing royal decrees, stopped pretending to be a man held together by anything but thread and formal wear. Into this void stepped the Chajewi, a group of around 50 hand-picked young men, selected for their beauty, trained in poetry, dance, and conversation, and given suspiciously powerful access to the emperor. Officially, they were attendants. Unofficially, they were companions. Extremely unofficially, they were the most controversial component of Gongmin's later reign, inspiring equal parts fascination, mockery, and moral panic. They accompanied him in the palace, sat beside him in court, and were given roles usually reserved for scholars or military officials, but none of them came from the elite. They were commoners, dancers, artists, prostitutes, survivors, and they were loyal not to the state, but to the man who plucked them from obscurity and turned them into living ornaments of his grief. The Goryeo, Korea's official historical record, tries its best to sound dignified while clearly side-eyeing the whole situation. It refers to these young men as being summoned frequently and mentions their unusual intimacy with the emperor. Ministers complained, monks despaired. One official reportedly resigned after being asked to train the Chajewi in calligraphy, declaring that parchment is no place for lipstick. Of course, to say Gongmin turned to men only after his wife's death oversimplifies things. There are earlier records of male attendants receiving unusual favor, and whispers that he was never exactly enthusiastic about the arranged performances of heterosexual marriage. But what shifted after Queen Noguk's death was the scale, the theater, the sheer volume of carefully curated, delicately perfumed male companionship, and the emperor's refusal to justify any of it. He also started painting. A lot. Monks, animals, Buddhas, naked boys. Sometimes the Chajewi modeled for him. Sometimes they posed in mourning robes. Sometimes they posed in nothing at all. The surviving artworks are rare, but the descriptions tell you everything. Gongmin was trying to capture something he'd lost: grace, beauty, youth, control, and preserve it in brush and silk. But empires are not preserved in grief, and Gongmin's reign unraveled. A palace coup, led by one of his trusted guards, ended his life in 1374. No grand betrayal, no noble rebellion, just a quiet knife in the night. The Chajewi scattered. Some were executed, others vanished into obscurity, their brief moment in the imperial sun reduced to scandalous footnotes. Gongmin is remembered with discomfort. He was a reformer who lost his will, a grieving widower who rebuilt his inner world with the soft smiles of teenage boys. Was it love? Was it escapism? Was it a final refusal to obey the cruel logic of dynastic masculinity? Yes, and maybe all at once. But if Gongmin's love was soft and sorrowful, the next emperor on our list wrote it down literally in his diary, confessing his uncontainable desire for a boy with eyes like daggers and a name he couldn't stop whispering. Let's step into the Mughal court of Babur. Babur. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, conqueror of Hindustan, descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, was a man of undeniable contradictions. He was ruthless in battle but tender in verse. A warlord in armor who could compose ghazals on the back of a horse. A devout Muslim who drank copious amounts of wine and wept over the fragrance of flowers. And tucked between the bloodied pages of empire building is one of the most poignant, unexpectedly tender confessions in all of royal autobiography, his love for a boy named Baburi. Let's be perfectly clear, Babur didn't try to hide this. In his Baburnama, his own memoir, written in Chagatai Turkish with surprising literary flair, he lays it out plain as day. While ruling Samarkand as a teenage warlord, Babur fell in love, not with a princess, not with a battlefield, but with a boy in the market of Andijan, a boy whose name, confusingly, was also Baburi. The moment is recounted with an almost embarrassing honesty that leaps off the page centuries later. He writes about seeing Baburi for the first time. Before this, I had never felt such an emotion for anyone. I used to go out of my way just to catch a glimpse of him. Babur, who fought battles against Uzbek Khans and scaled mountain passes with frostbitten troops, suddenly becomes a blushing teen, pacing the lanes of Andijan like a lovesick poet. He describes the agony of being near Baburi, of failing to speak to him, of seeing him from a distance and feeling his soul quake. He mocks himself for being tongue-tied. He writes verses filled with longing and confusion. I once tried to talk to him but could not even look him in the face. Imagine conquering Kabul but getting shy in front of a shopkeeper's son. That's Babur. And this isn't a one-off aside. The Baburnama returns to Baburi more than once, his face, his presence, the intensity of the feeling. It's tender, melancholy, and disarmingly sincere. There's no bravado, no sexual conquest, no bragging, just longing, aching, unfulfilled longing. Babur even notes how disappointed he was in himself for not being braver, for letting the moment pass. It's the kind of heartache you don't expect from a man who spent most of his life storming fortresses. Was it reciprocated? Almost certainly not. There's no record of Baburi responding, and Babur never claims anything happened beyond unrequited infatuation. And that's what makes it so human. This wasn't the story of a king taking a lover by force or a political marriage dressed up as romance. It was a crush, raw, unfulfilled, and maddening. Babur, for all his power, couldn't even say hello. Later in life, as he carved out his empire in India, Babur's references to Baburi faded. But his poems kept returning to themes of lost youth, impossible love, and beauty, glimpsed but never held. Some historians like to sanitize this. They call it a spiritual affection, a platonic ideal. But the text says otherwise. Babur knew what he felt. He called it love. He wrote about it not to prove a point, but because he couldn't not write about it. And that's the strange beauty of it. A man who could have had anyone, who had concubines and wives and children, never shook the ghost of the boy in Andijan, the boy who made him stammer, the boy who made the conqueror forget how to conquer. So while Babur's military genius established a dynasty that would rule India for over 3 centuries, his most enduringly vulnerable moment lies not on a battlefield, but in a quiet corner of his journal where power meant nothing and a king could confess, like any other boy, I loved him, and he didn't even notice me. But if Babur's heart was pierced by silence, Our next emperor took a more direct approach, elevating his male favorite to dizzying heights and rewriting court protocol just to keep him close. Time to revisit the Han dynasty and its long, aching tradition of emperors who loved out loud like Emperor Cheng. 15 kings in, and if you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for: curious, awake, probably a little unnerved, and definitely not watching at a normal hour. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And tell me, where are you right now? City, country, time of night or day? I want to know who else is on this strange, slow descent through royal secrets with us. Emperor Cheng of Han. If you ever wanted proof that power and heartbreak go hand in hand, look no further than Emperor Cheng of Han, a ruler who governed not with an iron fist, but with the fragile resolve of a man constantly torn between duty, indulgence, and the gaze of someone far prettier than public opinion could tolerate. Ruling from 33 BCE to 7 BCE, Emperor Cheng was a classic late Western Han monarch, born into privilege, surrounded by palace intrigue, and utterly exhausted by the parade of expectations strapped to his shoulders since birth. He was also, like many of his predecessors, a man caught between the iron codes of Confucian order and the soft pull of personal desire. And in the shadows of imperial etiquette, one figure rose quietly, then swiftly, then scandalously into the emperor's innermost circle, Zhang Fang. Zhang Fang's origins are appropriately humble. He didn't descend from ancient clans or war hero bloodlines. He wasn't a strategist or a scholar or even particularly interested in playing politics the traditional way. What he was, however, was beautiful. Impossibly, dangerously beautiful. And more importantly, he knew how to talk to Emperor Cheng when no one else dared. It began with proximity. Zhang Fang served as a palace attendant, one of the hundreds of finely dressed, carefully groomed young men whose job was to be present, quiet, and pleasing to the eye. But he wasn't just another decorative silhouette. He was quick-witted, attentive, and unnervingly good at predicting the emperor's moods. And Emperor Cheng, whose reign was already wobbling under the pressure of factionalism and childless concubines, latched onto him like a drowning man to driftwood. Soon, Zhang Fang wasn't just serving tea, he was offering opinions, then advice, then policy suggestions, then, inexplicably, imperial decrees began reflecting his exact phrasing. He was promoted to trusted positions far above his station. Titles fell into his lap like cherry blossoms. Ministers protested. Confucian scholars muttered, but Emperor Cheng ignored them all. And then came the scandal. The emperor had long been criticized for failing to produce an heir. His consorts, no matter how noble or numerous, remained childless. Behind closed doors, accusations of infertility swirled, most pointed at Cheng himself, suggesting excessive indulgence had rendered him impotent. Others, more quietly, suggested another reason, that his attention, his affection, and his nights were being spent not in the women's quarters, but in Zhang Fang's private residence. Records, predictably cautious, describe their relationship with the usual euphemisms: constant companionship, deep affection, unusual closeness. But behind these phrases lies an unmistakable narrative. Zhang Fang wasn't just a court favorite. He was the emperor's chosen, his companion, his comfort in a sea of pressure and ceremonial artifice. Some versions even claim that Cheng once cancelled an entire court session to nurse Zhang Fang through a minor illness. What really rattled the court was not the affection, it was the power. Zhang Fang was not merely loved, he was politically significant. His words could make or break careers, his enemies disappeared. His allies gained titles. Eventually, it wasn't clear whether he served the emperor or the emperor served him. And then, like most palace romances, it unraveled. Court politics turned hostile. Zhang Feng was accused of corruption, sedition, manipulating the emperor's favor. The pressure mounted. Emperor Cheng, torn between devotion and survival, chose silence. Zhang Feng was dismissed, disgraced, and quietly removed from court. Some say he died in exile. Others say he faded into private life, a relic of a ruler's greatest vulnerability. But Cheng was never the same. His health declined. His rule stagnated. He died suddenly, with no heir and no clear legacy, only a court haunted by the memory of the young man who once held the empire's ear and, more dangerously, the emperor's heart. And so, in the long annals of Han Dynasty history, Emperor Cheng is remembered not for reforms or military glory, but for a relationship that dared to elevate intimacy over inheritance. But if Emperor Cheng's story ended with silence and exile, the next king we meet embraced the scandal surrounding himself with a court of flamboyant men, offending bishops, baffling chroniclers, and rewriting what royal masculinity could look like. Enter William Rufus, William II of England, William Rufus. If medieval England had a royal don't ask, don't tell policy, William II of England didn't get the memo, or more likely torched it for fun and called it foreplay. Known as William Rufus, Rufus meaning the red, due either to his ruddy complexion or his temper, or possibly both, depending on how drunk the chroniclers were. He was the son of William the Conqueror and the most scandalously fabulous Norman ever to rule from a stone throne. He never married, never showed interest in women, had no acknowledged children, kept an unusually large number of good-looking young men at court, spent lavishly on silks, jewels, and finery, was described repeatedly as effeminate, godless, and a friend to vice. And somehow, still, historians spent the next several centuries pretending there was no clear evidence that he was gay. Let's take a closer look. William Rufus came to the throne in 1087, following his father's death. He inherited England, while his older brother Robert got Normandy, an arrangement that immediately caused friction because, well, sharing wasn't exactly part of the royal toolkit. William's reign was marked by rebellion, military skirmishes, chronic financial extortion of the church, and a stubborn refusal to do what was expected of him, particularly when it came to marrying a suitable woman and producing heirs. To put it bluntly, William seemed allergic to queens, and not just in the literal sense. In a time when kings were judged by their ability to marry and make babies like a feudal conveyor belt, William's complete disinterest in women was a screaming red flag draped in ermine. Contemporary chroniclers, particularly the ever-snarky Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, tiptoed around the issue with barely restrained disdain. They accused him of abominable vices, of surrounding himself with effeminate boys, and of filling his court with sodomites. That's not medieval subtlety, that's a gaydar alarm going off in the abbey. Let's talk about the court itself. Under William's rule, court fashion became noticeably more flamboyant. Long hair, tight hose, embroidered tunics, it was basically the Plantagenet version of a Queer Eye reboot. Nobles competed for his favor not through knightly valor, but through wit, charm, and the ability to rock a pair of pointed shoes without tripping on a flagstone. The king's inner circle was stacked with handsome young men who were described as being unusually close to him, physically, emotionally, and often disturbingly silent when questioned about their roles. And the church? The church was fuming. William famously feuded with Archbishop Anselm, a theologian so straight-laced he made parchment look sinful. Anselm accused the king's court of moral decay, called for reform, and tried repeatedly to get William to repent. William responded by mocking him, delaying his appointments, and continuing to prance about in his ruby-encrusted robes like a medieval Elton John. Was it performative? Absolutely. William wasn't just gay, he was provocative. He didn't want to hide, he wanted to shock. He rejected traditional piety, challenged clerical authority, and seemed to revel in being the antithesis of what a Christian king was supposed to be. He weaponized decadence. He made his sexuality, his style, his defiance into a form of royal branding. And yet, despite his dramatic flair, William's reign wasn't all theater. He was politically shrewd, militarily competent, and even managed to outmaneuver his brothers multiple times. But emotionally, he remained a fortress. No great love stories, no poetry, no heartbreaks recorded. Only the haunting absence of a queen and the ever-present entourage of beautiful men who called him Lord, with just a little too much sparkle in their eyes. His death, of course, was as mysterious as his love life. In 1100, he was shot through the chest by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, a royal assassination with a side of plausible deniability. The man who shot him, Walter Tyrrell, fled immediately. No one pursued him. And just like that, the Red King vanished, no wife, no children, no dynastic security, just a glittering, godless legacy that made priests nervous and historians defensive. But if William Rufus lived flamboyantly and died mysteriously, the next monarch on our list blurred the lines even further, donning makeup, dressing in women's clothes, and ruling a kingdom where queerness was both hidden in shadows and painted in palace murals. Let's journey now to the ancient kingdom of Silla and the peculiar gender-defiant reign of Hyegong of Silla. Some monarchs go down in history for their conquests, others for their reforms, assassinations, or spectacularly bad decisions involving cousins and poison. And then there's Hyegong of Silla, the 8th century Korean king who managed to reign for 14 years while being described in almost every available historical source as too pretty to be taken seriously. The court didn't just whisper that he wore makeup. They wrote it down, repeatedly, in ink. And that tells you everything you need to know about how much of a problem his existence was to the ancient scribes trying to pretend their world made sense. Hyegong ascended the throne of Silla in 765 CE at the age of 15, smack in the middle of a dynasty known for Buddhism, astronomical towers, and frequent civil war. An ideal environment for a gender non-conforming teen with a regency council and a target on his back. From the very beginning, Hyegong was surrounded by suspicions. Not because of his youth, Silla had no issue with young rulers, nor his politics, which were mostly dictated by regents, but because of his behavior. And by behavior, we mean the royal wardrobe. According to the Samguk Saji, one of Korea's oldest historical records, Hyegong was delicate in appearance, fond of wearing makeup and women's clothes, and inclined toward indulgent behaviors unfit for a king. To be fair, this could have just been early medieval slut-shaming, but the language used is too consistent to ignore. The court didn't merely imply he was soft. They called him unmanly. They accused him of neglecting state affairs in favor of beauty routines. They recorded his gender presentation with more concern than they recorded his tax policy. It wasn't just about cross-dressing. It was about control. Silla's monarchy was already deeply entangled in aristocratic bloodlines and elite power plays. The throne was often symbolic, used by court families as a chess piece in their endless games of marriage, bribery, and assassination. And here was Hyegong, young, gender non-conforming, and increasingly insistent on actually ruling, rather than just existing as a pretty puppet in brocade. The result? Absolute chaos. Hyegong's reign was plagued by rebellion. Not one or two uprisings, multiple full-blown attempts to remove him, often led by officials offended by both his politics and his presentation. The royal palace was attacked more than once. Conspiracies flourished like mushrooms in a damp tomb, and every time Hyegong tried to assert authority, the pushback was brutal. What's most telling is the language used by his enemies. They didn't simply accuse him of being weak or tyrannical. They attacked his masculinity, his beauty, his woman-like ways, his supposed inability to perform royal duties like a man. In a deeply Confucian culture where rulers were expected to model patriarchal virtue, strong, stoic, paternal Hyegong was a walking contradiction. And yet, he survived for over a decade. He ruled during a turbulent time and still managed to issue reforms, strengthen Buddhist institutions, and at least attempt to balance the increasingly corrupt court factions tearing Silla apart. But ultimately, the scandal surrounding his gender expression became inseparable from his politics. He wasn't just a monarch under siege, he was a monarch whose very body and clothing were seen as threats to the natural order. In 780 CE, the palace was stormed during yet another rebellion, and Hyegong was killed either by assassins or in the melee itself. His body was treated with little ceremony. His legacy, quietly buried in chronicles that didn't know how to categorize him, became a queer footnote in Korean history. The king, who was too feminine, too beautiful, too strange for the annals of respectable leadership. But for those reading between the lines, Hyegong was something more. A ruler who dared to blur the lines between king and queen, power and presentation, expectation and self-expression. He was punished for it, yes, but he never stopped being who he was, even as the knives closed in. And while Hyegong's reign ended in blood and scandal, the tradition of emperors doting on male favorites was far from dead. Let's turn now to another Han, Emperor Yuan of Han, whose quiet favoritism for two beautiful men reveals yet another chapter in China's long, complicated love affair with the passion of the cut sleeve. Emperor Yuan of Han. If the Western Han dynasty had a house style, it was a blend of political suspicion, stoic Confucianism, and the discreet power plays of silk-robed ministers with too much time and not enough loyalty. And then, amid all that rigid ceremony, came Emperor Yuan, a man so soft-spoken and cautious that his reign often reads like an extended apology. But behind the quiet reforms, the passive governance, and the measured court edicts, Emperor Yuan also carried on a tradition as old as the Han throne itself, elevating male favorites, doting on them extravagantly, and in the process, unsettling an entire imperial bureaucracy trained to pretend everything was normal. Born Liu Shi, Emperor Yuan ruled from 49 BCE to 33 BCE. By all appearances, he was the model of Confucian kingship. He reduced harsh laws, cut excessive spending, and spent most of his reign trying not to offend anyone too much. But beneath the surface was a man capable of intense affection that didn't always align with the public image of a fatherly, heterosexual sage ruler. Enter Honggong and Shi Xian. Both men began their careers in the palace as attendants, young, handsome, and exceptionally skilled at palace etiquette, which in Han China meant knowing when to bow, when to flatter, and when to be strategically beautiful without appearing ambitious. It was a delicate balance, and both of them mastered it, quickly, suspiciously quickly. Honggong first caught the emperor's eye, not through military valor or scholarly debate, but through his poise and elegance. He was charming without being overt, graceful without being soft, and attentive without being servile. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person an emotionally repressed emperor would find magnetic. The moment he entered Emperor Yuan's personal retinue, his status began to skyrocket. Land, titles, jewels. Even his relatives started receiving suspiciously generous promotions. But Hong Gong wasn't alone. Shi Xian, another male attendant, soon joined the emperor's inner circle, and the trio formed what court insiders began calling, with a mixture of disdain and thinly veiled panic, the Palace Triangle. The two favorites vied for attention, often publicly, with subtle digs, passive-aggressive glances, and full-blown factional maneuvering. And Emperor Yuan? He loved every second of it. He hosted them at private banquets, consulted them on court matters, gave them seats in ceremonial processions usually reserved for ministers or royal kin. The records never ones to say something directly. If they could say it poetically, refer to their presence at the emperor's side as uninterrupted as the moon's reflection upon still water. Translation: they were always there. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the court was not amused. Confucian scholars, already irritated by Yuan's lack of aggressive governance, now found themselves battling a new political enemy, two bedazzled twinks with imperial access. The situation was so volatile that one senior official reportedly wept in front of the emperor, begging him to return to proper conduct. Yuan responded by demoting him. Love or something like it clearly won the day. Yet Emperor Yuan's reign wasn't defined by open scandal. It was defined by silence. Unlike his great-grandfather Emperor Wu or his successor Emperor Cheng, Yuan never openly declared these men his favorites. But he didn't have to. Their influence was obvious, their presence unending. And when Yuan died in 33 BCE, their power vanished overnight, because it had never come from the court, only from his affection. Shi Xian was banished. Hong Gong was quietly stripped of his titles. Neither found favor with the next emperor. And in the official histories, their names appear only in passing, never accused outright, but always implied. Emperor Yuan, the quiet reformer, the Confucian moderate, left behind no dramatic declarations of love. But in the margins of policy memos and between the lines of tribute poems, you can feel it, a ruler whose deepest attachments didn't lie in statecraft, but in the soft companionship of two men who turned duty into intimacy and intimacy into quiet power. But if Yuan of Han was content with emotional discretion, our next king was decidedly not. He slept beside his fellow monarch, dined from the same plate, and marched into crusades arm in arm with the man who might have been more than just a fellow Christian prince. Let's cross the channel and dive into the knightly bond between Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France. Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart, crusader king, warrior saint, literary action figure, one of medieval Europe's most romanticized and misunderstood monarchs. He's the guy you imagine galloping into battle with wind in his hair and God in his sword arm, shouting oaths in Norman French and slicing heretics before breakfast. But while history celebrates his military genius and his near-mythic presence in the Third Crusade, it tends to get a bit quiet when it comes to his personal life. Specifically, the part where Richard shared a bed and perhaps quite a bit more with Philip II of France. Let's start with the basics. Richard I reigned as King of England from 1189 to 1199, though he spent barely 6 months of that decade actually in England. He considered it little more than a piggy bank to fund his crusades, and he said as much, charmingly describing his subjects as money bags to be squeezed for every last ounce of silver. He was brave, calculating, and ruthlessly effective in warfare. But in private, Richard was something else entirely. private, elusive, unmarried, and closely bound to a certain French king in ways that chroniclers of the time found deeply confusing. The relationship between Richard and Philip II of France has been described in contemporary sources with the kind of suggestive ambiguity that would make a monk choke on his incense. One chronicler, Roger of Hoveden, delicately noted that the two kings ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Now, in the 12th century, it was not entirely unusual for men to share beds. But context matters, so do patterns. Philip and Richard weren't just sharing campfires, they were inseparable for years, political allies, co-rulers of disputed territories, and according to several accounts, inseparable companions. The kind of inseparability that made other nobles uncomfortable. The kind that suggested the political alliance was lubricated with more than just mutual strategic interest. Even the church, rarely the subtlest of institutions, started whispering. Papal legates and bishops made note of their unholy affections. Their open displays of fondness at court became the subject of letters and mutterings, and while neither man ever publicly addressed the rumors, the tension was undeniable. Philip, the colder and more calculating of the two, seemed genuinely smitten. Richard, for all his theatrical masculinity, was noticeably indifferent to women. Even after he married Berengaria of Navarre under heavy political pressure, the two never produced children and spent virtually no time together. She never even set foot in England. Historians have long danced around Richard's sexuality. Some argue that he was celibate, too focused on war to bother with the distractions of the flesh. Others point to a confession made during one of his rare penitential moments, where he admitted to committing sins of the flesh, a vague phrase that could mean anything from adultery to homosexuality to eating bacon on a Friday. But what's notable is how those sins were described in ways that made certain bishops visibly uncomfortable. More telling is Richard's personal retinue, an entourage of young, handsome knights, carefully chosen and endlessly loyal, rewarded with gifts, land, and titles. His inner circle functioned less like a royal advisory council and more like a knightly version of a boy band, complete with matching outfits and poetic tributes. But as with all medieval queer history, clarity is elusive. Homosexuality, as we understand it today, didn't exist in the same way. Intense male bonds were normal, praised, even as long as they didn't challenge the patriarchy's reproductive imperative. And Richard? Richard walked that line like a man dancing between fire and canon law. When he died in 1199 from a crossbow wound during a minor siege, he was buried at Fontevraud Abbey at the feet of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. His heart was placed in Rouen, his entrails in Chaillot, and his memory split between holy warrior and the man who may have loved another king. But if Richard's romantic legacy is cloaked in ambiguous honor and crusader myth, the next emperor wore scandal on his sleeve, sometimes literally. Let's return now to China, where the Ming dynasty's wild child, the Zhengde Emperor, was rumored to host male lovers, fake his own identity, and throw imperial orgies no one dared stop. Zhengde Emperor. If the Forbidden City had a guest book, the Zhengde Emperor would have filled it with aliases, absurd costumes, and the names of men he probably shouldn't have invited over. Ruling the Ming dynasty from 1505 to 1521, Zhengde wasn't just eccentric, he was theatrical, hedonistic, rebellious in silk. A one-man imperial circus who treated governance like a part-time job and spent the rest of his time in elaborate fantasy role-play, accompanied by an entourage of unusually close male companions and one particularly controversial figure, Sayyid Hussein. Let's get something out of the way. Zhengde was not what Confucian officials would call emperor material. He was flamboyant, impulsive, and stubbornly disinterested in state affairs unless they involved exotic animals, dangerous stunts, or doing the opposite of what the court recommended. He staged mock battles in palace courtyards. He invented an alter ego named Zhu Shou and insisted that his ministers refer to him that way during expeditions. He even created a fake kingdom, complete with a fake banner and official titles just so he could pretend he wasn't the emperor, while still being obeyed like one. Think of it as LARPing with absolute power and no adult supervision. But beneath the antics lay something far more unsettling to the conservative Confucian backbone of the dynasty: Zhengde's relationship with a certain Muslim official named Sayyid Hussein. Sayyid Hussein, originally from Central Asia, first arrived in the Ming court as part of a diplomatic mission. He was intelligent, charming, and multilingual qualities Zhengde seemed to appreciate almost instantly. He rose swiftly through the ranks and became, essentially, Zhengde's constant companion. The two dined together, traveled together, and spent nights in the same quarters with a frequency that caused quite a lot of muttering behind the lacquered walls of the Grand Secretariat. Contemporary records dance around the nature of their relationship. The official histories frame it as one of favor and trust. But by favor, they mean absurd gifts, palatial estates, and the kind of public access that no foreign diplomat should have ever received. And by trust, they mean Zhengde once created an entirely new position just to keep Sayyid Hussein close, despite fierce protests from the court. It didn't help that Sayyid was described as exceedingly handsome, and always by the emperor's side. Nor did it help that Zhengde threw feasts for him that looked suspiciously like wedding banquets, or that he was rumored to refer to him in terms of beloved companionship in private correspondence. While nothing explicitly confirms the sexual nature of their relationship, the combination of poetic language, lavish attention, and utter disregard for court decorum paints a picture hard to dismiss as platonic. Zhengde, of course, didn't care what anyone thought. He doubled down. He filled his private palace, yes. He built a separate imperial playground just for himself, with actors, wrestlers, eunuchs, foreign dancers, and beautiful young men whose only qualifications were good cheekbones and willingness to ride tigers for fun. The place became a hive of scandal, farce, and rumored debauchery. Court officials begged him to return to his duties. Zhengde responded by going on fake military campaigns dressed as a general named Zhu Shou, dragging Sayyid Hussein along as his advisor. The relationship may have been more than personal, it was also symbolic. Zhengde, a Han emperor, openly favoring a Muslim foreigner in a Confucian court, was a giant middle finger to every expectation of Ming orthodoxy. It was pleasure as protest, desire as defiance. He died young, at age 29, after falling into a canal while drunk and contracting an illness he didn't bother to treat. Some say he died happy, unrepentant to the end. Sayyid Hussein vanished from records shortly after Zhengde's death, disgraced, exiled, or quietly erased, depending on which historian you believe. The court cleaned house. The private palaces were shut down. The eunuchs demoted. The narrative resanitized. But they couldn't erase the memory of an emperor who defied everything from tradition to sexuality to his own name just to live in the fantasy he preferred. And if Zhengde turned his reign into an erotic carnival, our next ruler made a single peach the most romantic and politically terrifying symbol in Chinese history. Let's visit Duke Ling of Wey and his infamous lover, Mizi Xia, Duke Ling of Wey. The spring and autumn period of ancient China, roughly 700 and 7476 BCE, was not known for its tenderness. It was an era defined by warring states, ritual propriety, and an arms race in bronze weaponry and passive-aggressive diplomacy. Against this backdrop of feudal tension and Confucian virtue, the story of Duke Ling of Wey and his lover Mizi Xia stands out like a delicate blush on a battlefield. It's one of the earliest recorded examples of same-sex affection in Chinese history, and it's immortalized not in scandal, but in a peach. Let's start with the cast. Duke Ling was ruler of the small but culturally significant state of Wei. Mizi Xia was a beautiful courtier, the kind of man the court described with poetic suspicion, charming, graceful, and always just a little too close to power for the minister's comfort. Their relationship was never really denied, even by ancient chroniclers, which says a lot in a time when most love stories were scrubbed clean of anything that couldn't produce heirs. According to the Han Feizi, a foundational text of Chinese legalist philosophy, Mizi Xia once bit into a perfectly ripe peach and, overcome by how sweet it was, decided to share the remaining half with Duke Ling. Instead of being offended by this somewhat unorthodox offering of pre-chewed fruit, Duke Ling was reportedly moved to tears. He saw it not as unhygienic, but as the purest gesture of love Mizi Xia had thought of him in a moment of joy and wanted him to taste it too. Now, modern readers might find this less than romantic. Sharing half-eaten fruit today is something you do with your toddler, not your sovereign. But in the highly ritualized world of ancient Chinese court life, where symbolism reigned supreme, this was peak intimacy. The peach wasn't just a peach, it was affection, trust, and vulnerability, offered without calculation. The gesture became so iconic that for centuries afterward, the leftover peach, Yutao, was a euphemism for male love. But peaches don't stay ripe forever. Like many imperial romances, the story of Mizi Xia ends not in soft fruit and softer glances, but in political decay and betrayal. Over time, the relationship soured, or more likely, Mizi Xia lost his influence as he aged. One version of the story tells us that Duke Ling eventually turned on his lover, accusing him of taking liberties with a royal chariot without permission. Yes, the man who once wept over a peach now ordered his favorite imprisoned for borrowing a ride. Worse still, Duke Ling allegedly used this incident to publicly shame Mizi Xia, claiming he had always been a manipulative and disrespectful presence in the court. This public reversal wasn't just petty, it was devastating. In the eyes of history, it marked the moment when affection became ammunition. The same gesture that had once symbolized love became evidence of criminal arrogance. The peach curdled into a cautionary tale. But here's the thing about myths. They linger longer than politics. Even as later Confucian scholars tried to dismiss Mizi Xia as a corrupting influence or an example of royal excess, the peach story endured. Poets referenced it, artists painted it, philosophers debated it. In a culture that didn't have a word for gay in the modern sense, the leftover peach became a quiet symbol, one that said, "This happened, this mattered." And Duke Ling? He becomes less of a person in the records and more of a narrative frame. A king so moved by love he broke the rules of etiquette, and then, so shackled by power, he destroyed the very thing that humanized him. His contradiction is the real story, a ruler who both honored and erased his beloved, all under the same roof. But if Duke Ling's romance with Mizi Xia became an ancient parable, our next ruler turned personal affection into political allegiance, raising his male lover alongside his dynasty and blurring the line between conquest and companionship. Let's now meet the founding emperor of Han himself, Liu Bang, better known as Emperor Gaozu, and the man who slept beside him through victory and wine, Emperor Gaozu of Han. Before he was Emperor Gaozu of Han, Liu Bang was just a crude, clever village sheriff with a gambling habit, a drinking problem, and an uncanny talent for surviving. By the time he clawed his way onto the throne in 202 BCE, founding one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history, he had outmaneuvered warlords, double-crossed allies, and charmed enemies with a mixture of charisma, profanity, and pure reckless momentum. He wasn't a polished Confucian sage. He was a back-alley brawler who happened to be brilliant. And, tucked into the folds of his unlikely rise, is a name that keeps reappearing softly but consistently: Ji Ru. Ji Ru, like many palace attendants of the early Han era, came from humble origins. He was likely selected for his looks, his poise, and his ability to make himself invisible when needed and unforgettable when necessary. But unlike most attendants, Ji Ru didn't just fade into the imperial bureaucracy. He stayed close, dangerously close to Liu Bang, close enough to accompany him in private, close enough to be present on military campaigns, close enough, according to several sources, to share his bed. Now, ancient Chinese chronicles weren't in the habit of writing fan fiction. When they mentioned that two men shared sleeping quarters, they meant it. And in Liu Bang's case, this wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple early records, most notably the Shiji, records of the Grand Historian, mention Ji Ru with a frequency that suggests far more than a servant-master relationship. He is referred to with language typically reserved for personal favorites: beloved, intimate, trusted, and trust, in Liu Bang's world, was a rarer currency than gold. To understand the significance of Ji Ru, you have to understand Liu Bang. This was not a man who let sentiment interfere with power. He executed former allies. He publicly insulted ministers. He once refused to rescue his own father from a siege because, as he allegedly said, "We'll make another father if I win." That's not a warm-hearted ruler. That's a Machiavellian opportunist in a peasant's tunic. So the fact that Ji Ru remained in his inner circle, survived the chaos, the rise, the coronation, and the paranoid purges that followed, suggests something deeply personal. And court officials noticed. They grumbled. Ministers began lodging complaints about Ji Ru's influence. Some even accused him of corrupting the emperor's moral focus, whispering that he was a distraction from statecraft, a symbol of indulgence unbecoming of a founding ruler. But Liu Bang didn't banish him. He didn't demote him. Instead, he gave him more access. During banquets, Ji Ru sat closer to the emperor than some of his generals. During crises, he was allowed into private chambers when even royal family members were barred. And unlike the emperor's wives, whom Liu Bang treated with a mix of fear and contempt, especially the famously ruthless Empress Liu Ji Ru never seemed to provoke his rage. If anything, he soothed it. What did they talk about? We'll never know. But consider this. Liu Bang, whose emotional range typically oscillated between sarcastic rage and drunken sarcasm, reportedly laughed more in Ji Ru's company than anyone else's. It may not sound like much, but in a time when joy was dangerous and trust was deadly, laughter was intimacy. And then, history did what history always does. After Liu Bang's death, Ji Ru faded from the record. He wasn't executed, which is remarkable. But he was pushed to the periphery, outlived by the empress, overshadowed by generals, footnoted in a dynasty that became obsessed with projecting moral legitimacy. But for a brief, bright moment, Ji Ru held a place no minister, wife, or general ever quite managed. He saw the emperor not just as a conqueror, but as a man. And Liu Bang, in turn, let himself be seen not as a legend, but as someone who could be loved. But where Liu Bang's affection was quiet and strategic, the next royal made no effort to hide his court of glittering male favorites. Perfumed, fashionable, and dagger-wielding, They were less companions and more stage decorations with political teeth. Let's step into the velvet-drenched world of France's Henry III, where masculinity wore lace and scandal wore perfume. Henry III of France. If the 16th century was a powder keg of religious wars, dynastic collapse, and apocalyptic anxiety, then Henry III of France was the man who lit the match with a velvet glove. Picture a king in ruffled collars and pearl earrings, strutting through the Louvre in high heels, trailed by a band of foppishly beautiful young men armed with swords and scented with musk. Now picture the Catholic League losing its collective mind over it. That, in essence, was the reign of Henry III, a monarch who tried to rule France between Protestants and Catholics while flanked by a glittering court of male favorites known as les mignons. Henry III wasn't just eccentric, he was extravagant. Raised in a court where Machiavellianism was a family value. His mother was Catherine de' Medici, after all. Henry developed a taste for performance early. Before he was even King of France, he was elected King of Poland briefly before abandoning the throne and fleeing back west, allegedly bored and homesick. When he took the French throne in 1574, he brought with him not just a suspicion of responsibility, but a deep love of theatricality, fashion, and extremely attractive men in coordinated outfits. Enter the mignons. These were not just courtiers. They were stylized accessories of royal power, walking works of homoerotic art who blurred the lines between bodyguards, companions, and romantic favorites. They wore lavish clothing, sported curled mustaches and earrings, and dueled over matters as petty as who had the better feathered hat. They were loathed by the nobility, mocked by the people, and loved intensely by their king. Henry surrounded himself with these young men at all hours. He dined with them, danced with them, confided in them. He gave them titles, wealth, land, and enough public affection to cause actual riots in Paris. They stood so close to him during official events that foreign ambassadors remarked on it in their reports, noting with concern that no woman had ever received such tender attention from the king. One famously dry Venetian diplomat wrote, "The king has no mistresses, but he is never without his mignons." The rumors were relentless. Satirical pamphlets called Henry a sodomite, a hermaphrodite, the Queen of France. Protestant polemicists accused him of orchestrating the moral collapse of the kingdom through effeminate heresy. And while historians still debate the exact nature of his relationships with his favorites, the sheer volume of intimate gestures, pet names, public caresses, and fiercely guarded loyalty suggests that this was about far more than court decorum. The king, for his part, never bothered to explain himself. He wore his pearls with pride. He spent lavishly on jewels and perfumes. He established monastic-style cults of chastity in his court that looked suspiciously like religious cosplay for closeted aristocrats. And he gave his favorites the kind of unchecked influence that sparked more than one attempted coup. And yet, for all the scandal, Henry III wasn't a frivolous ruler. He tried futilely to steer France through the wars of religion, to balance the collapsing Valois dynasty, and to assert royal authority in a country fracturing along theological lines. His attempts at tolerance were met with bullets. His attempts at courtly reform were drowned in lace and resentment. In the end, his enemies didn't just hate his policies, they hated his body, his voice, his lovers, and his refusal to perform masculinity the way the crown demanded. He was assassinated in 1589 by a Catholic fanatic who stabbed him while he was relieving himself. Yes, Henry III, the last of the Valois kings, died on the toilet in his nightgown. His final words were reportedly a request that his successor avenge him not just politically, but personally. Because by the end, Henry III wasn't just a king out of time. He was a symbol of everything his enemies feared: flamboyant, androgynous, disobedient to God and gender. But if Henry ruled with perfume and lace, the next name on our list fought in battle armor and sent tender letters to his male companion, vows of fidelity sealed in ink and blood. Let's ride into feudal Japan and meet Takeda Shingen, and the man who wore his heart on his sleeve, Kosaka Masanobu. Takeda Shingen. If you know Takeda Shingen, you likely know him as the Tiger of Kai, a brilliant daimyo of Japan's Sengoku period, clad in iron, banners blazing, who once made even the great Oda Nobunaga tread lightly. His military strategies were legendary, his cavalry nearly unbeatable, and his clan's battle standards emblazoned with Zen slogans like Furin-Kazan, as swift as wind, as gentle as forest, as fierce as fire, as unshakable as mountain, read like haiku, written in blood. He was a warlord's warlord. But beneath the battlefield mythos, behind the general's steely eyes and the decades of territorial conquest, lived a quieter story, a relationship, a bond written not just in loyalty, but in love. His name was Kosaka Masanobu. Kosaka Masanobu began his life as Kosaka Toratsuna, a samurai of minor lineage but undeniable grace. He served under Takeda from a young age, quickly rising through the ranks not solely because of his skill with a blade, though he had plenty, but because of something rarer, his closeness to the Lord himself. Records describe Kosaka as Shingen's constant companion, his most trusted man, and the shadow of the tiger. The implication being that wherever Takeda went, Kosaka was one step behind or beside. Their relationship, documented in letters and clan records, transcended the typical samurai-lord dynamic. In one particularly famous letter, Takeda writes to Kosaka in language so intimate it makes historians squirm. "My heart," he writes, "is comforted only when I know you are safe." In another, he asks Masanobu to meet him at night for counsel. A phrase loaded with ambiguity in a culture where courtly letters often doubled as coded invitations. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes not from what Takeda wrote, but what he allowed. Kosaka Masanobu was granted incredible access. He accompanied the daimyo not just into battle but into the inner circles of strategy and domestic governance, unusual for someone not born into high-ranking samurai aristocracy. He was entrusted with the defense of Kaizu Castle, one of the clan's most vital strongholds, and he was appointed to the Council of Retainers, an honor generally reserved for blood relatives or political allies, not, say, your possible lover. Now, let's talk about Shudo. The practice of male-male relationships among samurai was not only common but ritualized. Known as Shudo, the way of the youths, it referred to relationships between older samurai and their younger retainers, often involving mentorship, emotional intimacy, and yes, romantic and sexual elements. These bonds were idealized in literature and philosophy as pure, noble, and even spiritually elevating. It was thought that loving another man could deepen one's loyalty, sharpen one's honor, and refine the soul. Takeda and Kosaka's relationship fits this model almost too well. The age difference, the social dynamic, the language of loyalty and emotional vulnerability. It's not anachronistic projection. It's history, written in calligraphy and silence. But their story wasn't only candlelit poetry. It was forged in battle. Masanobu wasn't just a pretty face with good penmanship. He was a ferocious strategist. His defense of Kaizu Castle during Uesugi Kenshin's invasion is legendary. He was known for his stoicism, his brutal clarity in war, and his unwavering protection of Shingen's interests. Love, for them, was not soft. It was forged in armor and bound with steel. Tragically, Masanobu outlived Takeda Shingen. After the Lord's death in 1573, he remained loyal to the Takeda clan, serving Shingen's son with the same quiet ferocity. But it was never the same. His letters grew less frequent, his strategies more cautious, and when he died, he requested to be buried facing the mountains of Kai, the land where he had first met the tiger. Takeda Shingen may be remembered for his battlefield brilliance, but, Masanobu, he reminds us that even tigers can be tender. That in a world of blood oaths and honor codes, the strongest bond of all might be the one forged not by birth, but by choice. And if Takeda and Kosaka loved in silence through swords and strategy, our next emperor took a more delicate approach, favoring a gentle youth named Hongru, whose presence brought quiet scandal to a Han court already weary of imperial indulgence. Let's return now to Western Han China and the story of Emperor Hui, Emperor Hui of Han. If the Han dynasty had a soft spot, it was Emperor Hui. Wedged between the towering, iron-willed legacy of his father, Liu Bang, founder of the dynasty, and the icy political machinery of his mother, Empress Liu, Emperor Hui is often remembered as a quiet, indecisive figure, a king who ruled but did not reign, a monarch more at ease with poetry than policy, more comfortable in the palace gardens than in the war council chamber. And perhaps it's no surprise, then, that one of his closest and most controversial attachments was not a general or a minister, but a young courtier named Hongru. Now, to say Emperor Hui was under pressure is like saying a teapot under a bonfire is warm. He came to the throne in 195 BCE after the death of his father Liu Bang, the unrefined warlord who'd built an empire out of mud and charisma. Hui was nothing like him. Where Liu Bang was loud, crude, and fiercely pragmatic, Hui was gentle, soft-spoken, and introspective. While his father had ruled with sharp elbows and sharper execution orders, Hui hesitated, consulted, mourned, and, to the horror of the court, occasionally cried in public. And into this gentle power vacuum stepped Hongru. Described in the Shiji and Hanshu with language more suited to a romantic hero than a bureaucrat, Hongru was young, radiant, and exceedingly beautiful, with features that inspired admiration and envy alike. He was chosen as a court attendant, a role that in Han times was as much about elegance and etiquette as it was about serving imperial needs, whatever those needs happened to be. It didn't take long for Hongru to capture Emperor Hui's full attention, and once he did, he never left the emperor's side. Unlike many imperial favorites whose influence was limited to the personal sphere, Hongru's presence began to reshape the very rituals of court life. Emperor Hui took him everywhere, to banquets, to strategy meetings, even reportedly, to ancestral ceremonies where the presence of women and unofficial companions was strictly forbidden. This wasn't just favoritism. It was public affection, an emperor reshaping protocol to suit his heart, and the court noticed. Ministers began whispering that the emperor's behavior was unorthodox, that his nights were spent not in the women's quarters but in the company of Hongru, that he'd begun dressing in more decorative robes, influenced by his companion's aesthetic. The suggestion wasn't simply that the emperor was indulging a male lover, it was that he was allowing personal affection to contaminate public governance. Confucian scholars, already suspicious of Hui's pacifism, were scandalized. After all, in the Confucian worldview, the ruler was supposed to embody moral clarity, patriarchal control, and proper ritual observance. And here was the emperor, weeping over poetry, skipping military briefings, and holding hands with a boy in front of the imperial court. Even worse, he seemed completely unbothered by the disapproval. But Hui's affection for Hongru wasn't just a romantic indulgence. It was a shield, a sanctuary against the brutal politics that surrounded him, especially from his mother, Empress Lu. Empress Lu, who had clawed her way to the pinnacle of imperial power, saw Hui as a puppet and ruled from behind the curtain. She had rivals executed. She tortured concubines. She appointed her relatives to positions of unchecked power, and Hui, terrified of his own mother, retreated further into the solace of Hongru's company. There's no record of grand proclamations of love, no imperial edicts declaring Hongru an official consort, but the gestures speak for themselves: titles, gifts, unwavering access. And when Hongru was criticized by senior officials, Hui defended him not as a ruler defending a subject, but as a man protecting someone who'd given him something the throne never could: tenderness. Hui died young, at just 22. The official cause was illness, though many suspect emotional exhaustion played a role. After his death, Empress Lu took full control of the court, and Hongru vanished from the record, perhaps exiled, perhaps executed, perhaps quietly erased like a smudge on a silk scroll. But the story remained, whispered in corridors and footnoted in official histories. The emperor who loved a boy more than he loved power. And if Hui's love was gentle and melancholy, our next monarch's devotion was darker, tangled in espionage, suspicion, and relentless court theatrics. A king who preferred velvet-lined letters to royal declarations, Louis XIII of France, and the male favorites who held his heart in their gloved hands. Louis XIII of France. In the glittering courts of 17th century France, where wigs got taller as trust got thinner and secrets rustled through silk corridors louder than footsteps, Louis XIII ruled as a king shrouded in hesitation. He was not the kind of monarch who inspired fear or fanfare. Unlike his son, the magnificently self-obsessed Louis XIV, or his father, the swaggering, pearl-wearing Henry IV, Louis XIII was reserved, devout, chronically anxious, and terminally repressed. And if he is remembered today, it is often as the man who laid the groundwork for absolutism while whispering prayers, fearing women, and forming a suspicious number of extremely intense, emotionally fraught relationships with younger men, most notably with two, Charles d'Albert, Duke of Lune, and Henri Coiffier de Rouzet, Marquis of Cinq-Mars. Now, Louis was no firebrand. Crowned at the age of 9 after his father's assassination, he spent much of his youth under the thumb of his mother, Marie de Medici, and later his domineering chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. From the beginning, he was quiet, pious, and awkward, so afraid of women that courtiers whispered he flinched when touched by his future wife, Anne of Austria. Their marriage was more political merger than romance, a chilly affair that took over 2 decades to produce an heir, and even that seemed more the result of statecraft than passion. But if Louis kept his emotional distance from women, he seemed to pour that energy quietly but unmistakably into select young men. First came Charles d'Albert, better known as Luynes. Handsome, graceful, and infinitely attentive, Luynes rose rapidly through the court, ranks not by virtue of military brilliance or noble blood, but through his closeness to the king. Louis made him Grand Falconer of France, a strangely intimate role involving daily interaction, showered him with titles, estates, and privileges, and spent most of his private time in his company. They hunted together, prayed together, even reportedly shared chambers during royal progresses. When Luynes died suddenly in 1621, Louis collapsed into mourning. He withdrew from court life. He refused to speak for days. It was not the grief of a distant monarch, it was the heartbreak of someone who had lost their center. And then, in 1639, a new favorite arrived, Henri Coiffier de Rouzet, better known as Cinq-Mars. If Luynes had been a gentle companion, Cinq-Mars was something altogether more dangerous. Young, flamboyant, and unapologetically ambitious, he charmed Louis with practiced ease. The king, now in his late 30s, fell hard. He elevated Cinq-Mars rapidly, first as Grand Ecuyer, then as an informal advisor, and finally as something like a shadow consort. The court was scandalized, not least because Cinq-Mars made no effort to hide his influence or his desire for more. What made this relationship particularly incendiary was its timing. Cardinal Richelieu, France's most powerful man, had grown weary of Cinq-Mars and wary of the king's increasing dependence on him. Tensions escalated until Cinq-Mars, in a move that was either romantic folly or calculated treason, conspired to remove Richelieu. The plot was discovered. Cinq-Mars was arrested, tried, and executed, beheaded in 1642 at the age of 22. Louis said nothing. He signed the execution order. He watched the political machinery he helped build grind his favorite into the dirt, and then, once again, he fell into silence. He died a year later, pale and withdrawn, with no fanfare, no flourish, just a legacy wrapped in contradictions. Historians, eager to sanitize the past, have often labeled these relationships as deeply emotional friendships. But letters between Louis and his favorites tell a different story filled with longing, devotion, jealousy. In one note, Louis refers to Luynes as my only joy, my heart's comfort. In another, he pleads for Cinq-Mars to return to court. Your absence wounds me more deeply than any enemy. Louis XIII ruled France, but he never ruled himself. He clung to his favorites like lifelines in a sea of courtly manipulation and religious guilt. And though the church would never allow the truth to be spoken from the pulpit, the palace whispers endure. And if Louis veiled his love in prayer and poetry, the next emperor's passions were hidden not in letters but in shadowed corners of the Ming court, where loyalty, lust, and suspicion blurred beyond recognition. Let's enter the cryptic world of the Tianqi Emperor, Tianqi Emperor. The Ming dynasty did not end with a bang. It ended with a whimper, a wooden puppet, and a powerful eunuch who may or may not have been the emperor's one great love. At the heart of this final, bewildering chapter in Ming rule was the Tianqi Emperor, a man more interested in carpentry than court politics, who ruled China from 1620 to 1627 and left behind a reign that read more like a Gothic tragedy than a political chapter. Born Zhu Youjiao, the Tianqi Emperor ascended the throne at the tender age of 15. The death of his father, the Taichung Emperor, who lasted only a month before succumbing to either a laxative overdose or political poisoning, depending on who you ask, left the boy monarch utterly unprepared and totally uninterested in being a ruler. Tianqi wasn't stupid, but he was different. He had little to no formal education. He was barely literate, and he had one true passion, woodworking. Yes, the Son of Heaven, the ruler of the Middle Kingdom, the living link between the divine and the mundane, spent his days locked in a workshop building miniature furniture. Not metaphorically. Literally, he built tables, bird cages, and tiny carved toys, sometimes neglecting imperial audiences to polish a chair leg. The palace resounded not with proclamations, but with the delicate rasp of a file-smoothing lacquered wood. Into this vacuum of governance stepped one of the most infamous figures in Chinese history, Wei Zhongzhan. A palace eunuch of humble origins and boundless ambition, Wei quickly became the de facto ruler of the empire. His rise was meteoric and unprecedented. Within months of Tianqi's ascension, Wei had installed himself as gatekeeper to the emperor's ear, master of the inner court, and architect of a vast network of political repression. But behind his power, court whisperers insisted, lay something more intimate, an indescribable closeness, between emperor and eunuch that shook the already rotting foundation of the Ming state. Contemporary records, never eager to document taboo, used coded language to describe their bond. They called Wei the emperor's constant companion, his personal confidant, the one who knew his heart. Wei was allowed into the emperor's private chambers at any hour. He controlled access to the throne. Ministers often found their memorials dismissed without reading, while Wei's handwritten notes were executed without question. Rumors swirled. Some claimed the emperor and Wei dined together each night, laughing over wine while the empire burned. Others whispered that Wei bathed the emperor, dressed him, even slept near him in the imperial bedchamber. Though no official source dares state outright that the emperor and his eunuch lover were sexually involved, the circumstantial evidence forms a narrative too insistent to ignore. Tianqi himself never married, unusual for a Ming emperor. He took no empress, sired no heirs, and reportedly showed no interest in his concubines. When pressed to name a successor, he demurred. When officials begged him to dismiss Wei, he grew silent. His only acts of firm will were directed toward protecting the eunuch he seemed unable or unwilling to be apart from. Wei, meanwhile, behaved like a man both empowered and intoxicated by love. He erected shrines to himself, sculpted statues bearing his likeness, and purged anyone who opposed his dominance. Scholars, generals, and even imperial family members were imprisoned, exiled, or executed for daring to question him. His enemies referred to him as the Eunuch Emperor, a title that cut at both his status and his ambiguous role in the court's inner sanctum. But all reigns end, and this one ended in fire and shame. In 1627, Tianqi died suddenly, likely from complications of illness and years of neglected health. His younger brother, the Zhengde Emperor, took the throne and immediately turned on Wei. The eunuch was arrested. As imperial guards closed in on his estate, he hanged himself in disgrace. His corpse was later dismembered and scattered as a warning against unwholesome influence. History would attempt to erase the Tianqi Emperor as an unfit ruler, distracted, manipulated, inept. But beneath the sawdust and silence lies the shape of something else, a love neither acknowledged nor denied that shaped an empire's fall. And if Tianqi's strange affection became an empire's undoing, our next ruler continued the Han tradition of veiled intimacy, favoring a male companion so openly that court records couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Let's meet Emperor Jing of Han and the elusive figure of Zhou Wenren. Emperor Jing of Han. By the time Emperor Jing of Han ascended the throne in 157 BCE, the Han dynasty was past its bloody birth pangs and deep into its awkward adolescence. His father, Emperor Wen, had calmed the empire after Liu Bang's swashbuckling founding frenzy, instituting lighter taxes and Confucian restraint. Jing inherited that same gentle governance and, for the most part, maintained it. But what really makes him stand out in the annals of Chinese history isn't his reforms or his domestic policies, but his unmistakable fondness for a young courtier named Zhou Wenren, a man whose presence at court left historians squinting at official records and writing things like "favored beyond the norm," with all the passive-aggressive flourish of a Confucian bureaucrat. Let's start with Emperor Jing himself. Jing was not your standard-issue autocrat. He was thoughtful, cautious, and deeply committed to avoiding scandal traits that earned him more footnotes than fanfare. He's often overshadowed by his son, Emperor Wu, who would go on to become one of the most powerful emperors in Chinese history, waging wars, expanding territory, and basically turning the Han dynasty into China's answer to the Roman Empire. But Jing? Jing kept things low-key. He was a man who preferred stability to conquest, conversation to decree, and according to court gossip, Zhou Wenren to just about anyone else. Zhou Wenren enters the story as a palace servant. He had the kind of delicate beauty that ancient Chinese literature loved to elevate graceful bearing, a composed demeanor, and the uncanny ability to be everywhere the emperor needed him, without ever quite seeming like he tried. What made Zhou different, however, wasn't just his charm or looks. It was the sheer speed of his ascent. Jing elevated Zhou rapidly, bypassing more experienced ministers and bypassing the sons of noble families who expected such posts by birthright. He granted him access to the emperor's private chambers. He began consulting him on state matters. He gave him expensive gifts, robes, jade, land. Court watchers, famously allergic to subtlety, began to whisper. Officials who tried to question Zhou's influence were either ignored or delicately sidelined. All the classic signs of imperial favoritism were there, except the favored one wasn't a concubine. He was a man. Of course, the historical records never come right out and say they were lovers. This was ancient China, after all, but the euphemisms practically glow in the dark. Zhou Wenren was called a close companion, a beloved servant, a man often in the emperor's presence, and most tellingly, the one who alone calmed the emperor's spirit. The relationship between Emperor Jing and Zhou Wenren didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a broader pattern in the Han dynasty, which, despite its Confucian public front, was rife with imperial male-male affection. From Emperor Ai's famous cut-sleeve anecdote to Emperor Cheng's showering of affection on his own male favorites, the Han court was no stranger to intimacy between men. What set Jing apart was his discretion. He never made a public display. He never gave Zhou a formal title of consort or prince, but he also never let him go. What's fascinating is how Zhou's influence played out politically. Unlike other favorites who overreached and fell, Zhou seems to have known exactly how to wield his power quietly, efficiently, and without stepping on too many aristocratic toes. He served as something of an emotional advisor to the emperor, helping him navigate internal court tensions and palace intrigue. When major decisions were made, Zhou's fingerprints were often there, never obvious, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Zhou's power lasted as long as the emperor lived. When Jing died, his successor Emperor Wu purged many of the former court's allies to establish his own rule. Zhou Wenren, surprisingly, survived this transition, perhaps because he had no ambition beyond his service to Jing. Perhaps because, by then, he had already faded into the folds of legend, his role more symbolic than threatening. What we're left with is a story written in subtext. A quiet emperor, a beautiful servant, a love or at least an affection that defied public convention but never courted scandal. It didn't shake the empire. It didn't provoke rebellions or feasts of poetry, but it endured. In the end, it was not passion that defined their bond, but constancy. And if Zhou Wenren was the still water that soothed a cautious emperor, the next king was a firebrand, bold, brash, and rumored to have shared not just war councils, but possibly beds with one of Europe's most formidable monarchs. Let's move from Han China to the thunderous crusading fervor of medieval England and the stormy companionship between Richard II and his very favorite, Robert de Vere. Richard II of England. Richard II is the kind of king who would have preferred an elegantly staged monologue to a battlefield. He was theatrical, poetic, emotionally volatile, and never quite fit the mold of medieval masculinity expected of a Plantagenet monarch. Crowned at just 10 years old in 1377 following the death of his grandfather, the legendary Edward III, Richard entered the throne wearing a crown too big for his head and carrying expectations even larger. Unfortunately for England, he would spend the rest of his reign trying to turn politics into performance art, with a court full of loyal sycophants, lavish expenditures, and one very particular, dear companion, Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Now, most medieval kings surrounded themselves with favorites. That's not unusual. But Richard's relationship with de Vere took favoritism and turned it into obsession, scandalous, gilded, and politically disastrous obsession. While queens were ignored and Parliament fumed, Richard poured his affection, wealth, and trust into a man who, for all his privilege, wasn't particularly liked by anyone else. Let's rewind. Robert de Vere was Richard's childhood friend, young, dashing, and reportedly magnetic in that annoying way people are when they've been born into titles and know exactly how to use them. When Richard came of age, instead of seeking counsel from experienced barons or political veterans, he leaned on de Vere, not just for advice, but for companionship. And not just for companionship, but for, well, let's just say the line between political and personal got extremely blurry, extremely fast. By the late 1370, de Vere was already one of the most powerful men at court. Richard elevated him from Earl of Oxford to Marquis of Dublin, a title so newly minted, so absurdly high for someone of his background, that it felt more like a coronation than a promotion. It was England's first marquisate, and not long after, Richard upped the ante and named him Duke of Ireland. The nobility lost it. Imagine you're a powerful English lord, third-generation crusader, and suddenly this handsome court butterfly with no battlefield experience is being handed Irish dominion and the king's full affection. It didn't just look suspicious. It looked romantic, scandalous, dangerous. Rumors began to spread, some whispered, some shouted that the king's devotion to de Vere wasn't purely fraternal. And Richard did nothing to tamp them down. Quite the opposite. He gifted de Vere lands, threw him elaborate feasts, and ignored parliamentary warnings about favoritism. He was said to cling to him in public, speak of him with tenderness, and even reportedly cried when he was forced to send him to govern Ireland, effectively a gilded exile to cool the court's fury. Even Queen Anne of Bohemia, Richard's wife, seemed more like an afterthought in all this. Their marriage was politically expedient and apparently platonic. They were rarely seen together, and though Anne was popular with the people for her grace and diplomacy, she had no real influence over her husband. That role belonged, quite clearly, to Robert. The crisis came in 1387. A group of powerful nobles calling themselves the Lords Appellant rose up to curb the king's excesses. De Vere led a royal army against them, only to suffer a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Radcot Bridge. He fled the country. Richard was forced into submission. De Vere was condemned in absentia and stripped of his titles. The king was devastated, and he never really forgave England for it. Though de Vere died in exile a few years later, allegedly thrown from a horse during a boar hunt, Richard kept his memory close. Some say he wore de Vere's emblem sewn into his clothes. Others claim he kept his letters, his gifts. Either way, the emotional wound never healed. Richard grew paranoid, erratic, increasingly authoritarian. He purged his enemies, declared his will divine, and eventually lost the throne to his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who, it must be noted, had been one of de Vere's fiercest critics. When Richard was finally imprisoned, and almost certainly murdered in 1400, he died not just as a fallen king, but as a man whose most enduring loyalty had been to someone history refuses to call a lover, but can't quite call just a friend.